Finding Love. Copyright 2015 by Samantha Price. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day. 2 Timothy chapter 1 verse 12. Moira Shantz was the youngest in her family, and she had always known that she was different. Her siblings, 2 older brothers and 2 older sisters, were all married and all had at least one child. Miriam, the eldest, now had 3. Moira knew that her parents, and her entire family, wanted nothing more than for her to have the same life that they had, but Moira ached for a different life. The small town of Earltown was a quiet and peaceful farming community, but there was more to life and Moira wanted to experience it. Moira chewed on her fingernail as she looked out of her bedroom window and contemplated life and love. She questioned the beliefs of her family, and wondered why they kept separate from the Englishers. She knew that the bishop had always said that the Englishers would lead them astray, and that's why they couldn't associate with them. Moira knew that was true for the most part. She'd seen some of the Englishmen falling around drunk in the street, and she knew that she wouldn't want to be friendly with those types of people anyway, but she knew that many of the Englishers she'd met were nice people. Couldn't they have their own beliefs without their ideas threatening what she believed? After all, her brother-in-law Stephen had grown up as an Englisher before his family joined the Amish. Her attention was drawn to the ground beneath her bedroom window, where her 2 large dogs were chasing each other as though they were pups. They ducked and weaved, and then they would tumble around the ground amidst flashing of mean-looking long teeth. Moira sighed and remembered when her life was so simple. When she was younger, she had planned her life. She had assumed she would marry Tom Miller since she'd always loved him. Then seeing the lives of her sisters had made her think twice about whether marriage and family were what she wanted. Surely there was more to life than reproducing. And if not, then her siblings were making up for it if she never chose to follow in their shoes. In your room by yourself again, Moira? Moira whipped her blonde head around to look at her mother, who was standing in the bedroom doorway. Moira held up her brush. 100 strokes a day. Isn't that what you taught me? Her mother smiled. You seem to do an awful lot of sitting and looking out the window when you aren't brushing your hair. Mrs. Shantz sat on Moira's bed, and Moira sensed the unspoken questions in the gesture. Do you want to tell me or talk to me about something? Moira swiveled on the windowsill, tossed her brush on the bed and turned to face her mother. I'm just wondering if there's more to life than having what Hazel and Miriam have. I know they're happy, but I think it will take more than that to satisfy me. Her mother frowned. That's nonsense talk, Moira. Whatever do you mean? Moira looked back out the window, then back to her mother. I used to want to have my own family, my own children, but now I'm not so sure. What else is there? Her mother asked, a frown deepening the lines in her forehead. There has to be something. Do you want to become an old maid, a maiden aunt? Is that so bad if that's my choice? No one wants that, her mother said. Then I probably shall become that. I know you've always been in love with Tom since you were a little girl. Do you still like him? He hasn't got a girl as far as I know. He could be waiting for you. Moira could not tell her mother that marriage to Tom would make Moira trapped in the small town when she knew in her heart there was more to life. She gauged on her mother's face whether she could share such a thing. Tom's nice, but if I married him, I know exactly what my life would be like. I'd never go anywhere or see anything. You could visit other places. Moira nodded. She was right, her mother wouldn't understand what she felt. No one ever understood her. Her brothers and sisters had no patience with her, they would always see her as the brattish, whiny younger sister. Looking after her nieces and nephews was fun, but sometimes it was hard work. She saw the weary look on her sisters' faces as they cleaned, cooked and looked after their husbands and their young ones. It was admirable that they worked so hard, but Moira knew in her heart that the life they had was not for her. Since Hazel had gotten married, Elsa Wiley had come to live with the Shantz family. Elsa's parents had died before she'd come to America, and the Shantz now had many spare bedrooms since Moira was their only child living there. Before their death, Elsa's parents had arranged for Elsa to leave Germany to marry Stephen Williams, the man whom Hazel had eventually married. Elsa had refused the match, telling her parents she would not marry a man she had never met. But she did honor the first part of their wishes, that she come to America, and so here Elsa was now living in the Shantz household. Moira had found a kindred spirit in Elsa. Neither of them wanted to be married off to someone and have a dozen children. Elsa had been appointed the local schoolteacher since she was smart. She knew about history, she could quote long passages from famous books, and she had an uncanny knack at explaining things so that they made sense. Elsa and Moira would walk the fields for hours, talking about how they were not like the rest of them, the rest of the Amish. Moira glanced down at the two dogs, now jumping all over her father who had just arrived home. Elsa and Moira had rescued the dogs when they were about to be drowned down at the creek. An old farming dog had had her last litter, and the owner couldn't find homes for them. Elsa and Moira had been walking by the creek when they saw the old man with a burlap sack over his back. They heard the cries from within the sack. The old man had no qualms about telling them what he was about to do. Elsa insisted that the old man give them the pups, and he handed them over. "Do you remember when we brought Ben and Muttley home, Mom?" Her mother giggled. "I've never seen such tiny pups so full of energy." "They haven't changed in the energy department," Moira said. "They've brought us a lot of joy," Mrs. Shantz said. "They have," Moira said, as she looked out the window at her father petting them. "You're changing the subject, Moira. What's really going on in your mind? Are you upset that Elsa got the teaching job over you?" "No, not at all. I'm happy for her, and I'm sure she'll be a better teacher than me." "You were a good student." "Thank you, Mom, but I'm not looking for any encouragement or kind words." "What are you looking for, Moira? Your father and I are a little concerned. It's a little hard to fill my days now with Elsa gone for most of the day. Anna Stutzman is often sick, so I feel that I can't go over and sew as I used to." "Yeah, she's not been too good for a while. I don't know what is to become of me sometimes, Mom. I don't want to have what my sisters have." Her mother leapt to her feet. "Why do you keep saying that? You should want what they have. They have wonderful husbands and children. What else could you possibly want other than what God has designed?" Moira felt small under the weight of her mother's judgment. "I don't know, Mom. Is this all there is? We get married, have children, and then die? That's silly talk. I don't want to stay here and hear another word of it." Her mother left the room. It was only Elsa whom Moira felt free to talk to. At that point, Moira knew she had to get away, even if she just went and visited another town. Maybe that would satisfy her need for a change. Her mother poked her head around the bedroom doorway. "Don't forget it's dinner at the Stutzmans tonight." "Shall I go early to help?" Moira asked. "Yeah, that would be good." "I'll head there now then," Moira said, glad of something to do apart from the mundane chores at her house. 4 of the 5 Stutzman boys had married in the last 2 years, and the 5th and oldest Stutzman boy, Adam, was married to her oldest sister. The families had always been close, and the Stutzmans had shared their farming income from the day her family had set foot in America. Between them they owned 3 large pieces of land side by side and grew various crops. Chapter 2. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff they comfort me. Psalm chapter 23 verse 4. The evening meal at the Stutzmans' house wasn't the same as the usual dinner between their expanding families. This time Bishop John was there with his wife, Tabitha Fair. He was staying with the Stutzmans because Mr. Stutzman had just been made a minister. Mr. Stutzman was to be guided in his duties by the bishop. Moira did not envy Mr. Stutzman the responsibility he was to shoulder. In fact, responsibility was a word that Moira had never liked. Having responsibility meant that people were relying on you, and that there was a chance of someone being let down. "What have you been doing with yourself lately, Moira?" Tabitha asked. Moira knew that question really meant, "Why are you the only woman at this table aside from Elsa who isn't married? Is there something wrong with you?" "Just the usual type of things, quilting, helping with all my nieces and nephews," Moira answered. "You should be looking after your own children by now." "How old are you?" Tabitha asked. Moira screwed up her face and looked at her mother, hoping she would intercede. Her mother looked down at her food, so Moira knew she was on her own. "I'm nearly 20, and I'm not ready yet to end my life." A hush fell across the table, and everyone looked at her. "What I mean is, I'm not ready to end my life as I know it as a single person. I'm not ready to be joined with another in matrimony." Moira smiled, hoping that she had redeemed herself from her harsh comment about her life being over if she got married. The bishop said to his wife, "You were 25 when I married you, weren't you, Tabitha?" "Yeah, I was, and that was different. Moira has many men to choose from here." That was news to Moira. Did the bishop's wife mean she chose the bishop because he was the only man to choose from? Moira glanced up at Elsa, who smiled at her, clearly thinking the same thing. They were good friends and always found so much to laugh about. They had become like sisters and often knew the other's thoughts. Moira's attention turned, as they often did, to Tom Miller. She'd been in love with him ever since she had arrived in Earltown. She knew if she married Tom, she'd be in the community forever, and there would be no way for her to get out. Her desire to go and see something of life beyond Earltown, Lancaster County, was stronger than her love for Tom. "I was thinking that I'd like to go and see something of a different town, meet different people, before I become a wife and a mother." The bishop set down his knife and fork and then cleared his throat. "If that's what you'd like to do, I think I've got an opportunity for you to do just that." Tabitha peered into his face. "What opportunity, John?" she asked. The bishop looked at his wife and then spoke to Moira. "A small community has settled in Coulson County. It's just a handful of 5 families, but there are close on 20 children, and they could do with a schoolteacher. They've just finished building a schoolhouse, and they don't even have a teacher. They were about to become more aggressive in their search for someone to fill the role, so I'm glad I found you. I'm sure you'd fit in nicely." "Thank you, I'd love to teach. I wanted to be the teacher here, but Elsa was better at it than me." Moira smiled at Elsa. "You're good at numbers, reading, writing, and history. You'll make a very good teacher," Elsa said. "Moira was the best student in her class, and she's always picked up things quickly," her father said. "Wonderful," the bishop said. "I'll find a family for you to stay with." Moira looked at her parents. "Is that really what you'd like to do, Moira?" her father asked. Moira nodded enthusiastically. At last she could get away and see a different part of the country. Moira then looked at her mother, who said, "You don't need my permission. You're old enough to make up your own mind." "Yeah, I'd like that very much, thank you," Moira said again to the bishop. "Good, I'll make the arrangements and have someone come and fetch you in 1 week from today." "So soon?" Hazel asked. "I'll write to you," Moira answered Hazel, the sister she was closest with. "It'll hardly be the same," Hazel muttered. "I don't want you to go." Moira knew that Hazel and the others would miss her, but she had to do what was right for herself. She had to have some excitement in her life, or she would surely suffocate from boredom. 1 more week, just 1 more week before she left. Everything she wanted to do in that week ran through her mind. She would sew some new dresses to start her new life in some new clothes. She would learn some handy things about being a schoolteacher from Elsa. Moira picked up her glass and took a large gulp. Being a teacher would be a huge responsibility. The babies began to cry. Once one started, the others weren't long to follow. Their mothers left the table in an effort to keep them quiet. Chapter 3. Who knoweth not in all these that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this? Job chapter 12 verse 9. A week had gone by way too fast. The bishop had arranged everything, and tomorrow Moira would leave Earltown. Tom asked her to go on a buggy ride the night before she left. He said it was to say goodbye, and Moira wondered whether he was going to try to stop her going. She was pleased to go on the buggy ride with him, and was sure that she couldn't keep the smile from her face. Moira loved to be around Tom and hoped he felt the same. Tom called for her early, but she was ready and waiting. In the beginning of the ride, he was more quiet than usual. Tom stopped the buggy near an old mill. He put out his hand and helped her down. "Thank you, Tom." He was a plain man, but he was solid and dependable. He liked his food, and it showed, even though he worked hard in the fields. Moira was certain that he was the most kind and gentle man that she had ever known. When they walked a little further, Tom said, "Are you sure that you want to leave here, Moira?" Maybe she could be talked out of leaving, so she pondered that thought. "I think it will be a good thing for me. I need to get out of this town." He rubbed his chin. "What's wrong with the town?" "Nothing really." Moira shrugged. If you feel you need to get out, you could visit another town. I have an aunt in Ohio. I could arrange for you to visit her and her family. She's very welcoming. Thank you, Tom, but it's not just that I need to leave for a while. I need for my life to be different. Do you understand? Marry me then. Moira gulped and stopped walking. That's not the change I had in mind. Tom ignored her reply. I don't know why I've never asked you, but I've been thinking about it for the longest time. I never knew if you felt the same. That's why I never asked. She started walking again and he walked by her side. She glanced sideways at Tom. How couldn't he know how she felt? She was certain that everyone knew that she had always loved him. You'd marry me to keep me here? Moira asked. I'd marry you because I've always loved you, Moira Shantz. You're the most lively, smart, engaging girl that I've ever met, or that I could ever imagine. You had my heart from the moment I saw you at that very first gathering at Mom and Dad's house. Moira giggled as she thought back to that first time she'd seen Tom. That was a long time ago. Don't give me your answer straight away. I'll wait for you to think on things. Go away if you must, for a time. She stopped walking again, turned and looked into his deep blue eyes. Moira knew the next words that came out of her mouth would change the direction of her life. I've always thought that if I were to marry, I'd marry you. His worried expression changed into a smile which brightened his face. You will marry me? She shook her head. I can't. I can't marry you because I need to discover more of the world and more of myself. She walked on. I don't know whether there is something wrong with me, or why I'm so different from everyone else, she said. It's because you're so smart, Moira. Moira laughed and glanced up into his face, which was about a foot above her own. You think I'm smart? You are. You think more about things than most of us do. I won't hold you back. Go and discover the world, and I'll be waiting for you when you come back home. No, I won't do that to you. You can't wait for me. I can if I say that I can. She shook her head. No, I can't say that I'll be back except for a visit. Maybe I will, but I don't know that for sure. My whole life is full of uncertainties, and I won't have what I do with my life affect another. My dear Moira, that is a very noble notion. You can't escape from the fact that whatever you do affects many people in ways that you might never know. Moira blew out a deep breath. You want to stay here and I might never come back. I don't want you to wait for me. Tom rested an arm lightly around her shoulders. Don't look so worried. I won't wait then, but if I should happen not to be married when you return, my offer is always open. Shall we leave things like that? Moira looked straight ahead. Don't write to me, Tom. It will complicate things for both of us. He looked down and softly kicked a small pebble out of his way. I hadn't expected that you'd say that. I don't want you to write, okay? He had to understand that it would be best for both of them if he didn't. If that's what you wish, I won't write to you, he said quietly. When they finished their walk, Tom took her back home. Before he drove off, his last words to her were, Don't forget me, Moira Shantz. Moira stood and watched him drive away. Part of her wanted to run after him and say that she would marry him, but she didn't. She knew that she might be making a big mistake, but she knew what life would be like if she married Tom. What she didn't know was what life would be like if she moved to Coulson County. She desperately wanted the chance to find that out. Moira had said goodbye to all her friends and family, and she had given her nieces and nephews special cuddles. She would miss them all, but this was something Moira had to do. Her mother and father waited with her for Jeremiah King, who was to fetch her. Then she would travel with Jeremiah to the bishop's house in Reading. From there, they would continue their 9-hour journey to Coulson County. It's so far away, her mother said, blinking back tears. I'll write to you, Mom. I'll write as often as I can. Her mother nodded, and her father put an arm around her mother's shoulder. I hope this is what you want, Moira. I know you've been restless, and you've been looking for something other than what we can give you. I hope you find whatever it is that you're looking for, Mr. Shantz said. Thank you, Dad. The sound of hoofbeats caused Moira to run to the window. That's got to be him, she said. Jeremiah King. Her mother joined her at the window. He is a fine-looking young man. I'm sure he's married, Mom. Moira said, in an effort to stop her mother from mentally marrying her off to every man who came anywhere near her. Her father walked through the front door to greet the man who'd just stopped a wagon at the front of their house. Moira and her mother followed. After her father introduced Jeremiah to everybody, Jeremiah noticed Moira's bags by the door. "I'll get those bags for you, Moira." Jeremiah picked up the bags and placed them in the back of the wagon. "Would you like to stay for coffee or some refreshment, Jeremiah? Before you head off?" Mrs. Shantz asked. "Thank you, but we better get going so we can be at the bishop's house by nightfall." "Yeah, of course," Mrs. Shantz said. Moira was grateful that their goodbyes wouldn't be prolonged by having Jeremiah come in for coffee. It was hard enough to say goodbye as it was. After Moira said goodbye to her parents, she jumped up into the wagon. As they drove away, she knew that her mother would cry, and she was right. She had to turn her head away, closing her own eyes tightly, and think of something else entirely. When she opened her eyes, she noticed Jeremiah looking at her. "Is this the first time you've been away from home?" Jeremiah asked with a smirk on his face. "This is the first time I've been far away from my parents. I've spent nights away at relatives' places, but I've never been very far away from my parents ever." "Where do you live?" "Colson County, where I'm taking you." "You do?" "I wasn't certain when the bishop said you were picking me up. I didn't know if you lived there or if you're just taking me there." "Yeah, I live there with my father and my younger brothers and sisters. It's been arranged for you to stay with my father's sister, my Aunt Millie." "Act good. What's she like?" Jeremiah laughed. "She's a different kind of a person. She's very happy that you're coming to stay with her. She's excited to have some company. It's good she's pleased." "I wouldn't want to stay with someone who didn't want me there," Moira said with a laugh in her voice. "This is the first time you've been a teacher? Or have you taught somewhere else?" Moira struggled with the thoughts that she didn't know enough to be a teacher. Everyone had assured her that she did. Even Elsa had said Moira should do a fine job. "Yeah, this is the first time I've done any teaching, but I was always very good in school. I was top of my class at my school back in Switzerland." "Ah, you came from Switzerland?" "I came from Germany. I've been here for 7 years," he said. "I've been here for about 5, she said. After a lull in the conversation and many more miles had passed, Moira asked, "How many brothers and sisters do you have?" "Yeah, lots of them. I'm the eldest, and I might as well tell you about my mother. I'm sure someone will tell you sooner or later anyway. My mother left the community and ran away with a man. He was a merchant from New York. I don't know how long she had known him, or how long things had happened between them, but one day she just up and left. I've never heard from her since." Moira felt uncomfortable with what he had just told her, and didn't quite know how to react. "Sorry to hear that," she said. "That must have been very hard for you." She'd always been an unhappy person. Maybe she's happy now. He looked over at Moira and smiled. "I suppose your father took that very hard?" "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to pry." Moira bit her lip. Jeremiah laughed. "Don't concern yourself about things like that. I can see you're well brought up and a well-mannered girl. I was the one who told you about my mother." He looked at the dirt road ahead. "He took it very hard in the first few months, but now he's okay." Moira looked over the wispy grasses across the plains. Maybe Jeremiah's mother had been restless and wanted to see more of the world, just like Moira did. Moira hoped that she would be happy and satisfied with where she was going. "Do you have many in your community?" "It's only small. Around 30 of us, the adults that is. And not too many children." They reached the bishop's house just on dark. The bishop's wife had made a meal of lamb stew and vegetables, including mashed potatoes and sauerkraut. After dinner and before they were shown to their bedrooms, they had a lengthy Bible reading and discussion afterward. Moira was tired, and wondered if this is what the bishop's family did every night or only when they had visitors. At home, her family sat to read the Bible together only on Saturday nights. When Moira finally went to bed, her tummy was still feeling as though it was being tossed to and fro in the bumpy wagon. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast, they were on the road again. "How long will it take us to get there now?" Moira asked Jeremiah. "Not that far from here. We should be there by mid-afternoon." I'll take you directly to Aunt Millie's house. I can't wait to meet her, Moira said. I won't say too much about her. Then there's Millie's sister, my other aunt, Selma. Both of them are Dad's sisters. Selma's always at Millie's house. He gave a chuckle. I'll let you make up your own mind about Millie. Moira gulped. Now you're scaring me. What is it that I should know about Millie? Jeremiah chuckled. I'm only joking with you. I hope so, Moira said. You do like cats though, don't you? Jeremiah asked. I like all animals. I've got 2 barn cats at home and 2 dogs. Moira then rattled off all the farm animals her family owned: pigs, chickens, horses, and goats. Millie has 5 cats and they all live in the house, not the barn or outside. Chapter 4. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter. And day and night shall not cease. Genesis chapter 8 verse 22. When Jeremiah stopped the wagon, Moira jumped down and looked at the cottage. It was white with bright blue trim surrounded by a flourishing garden. Jeremiah stood next to her. Well, what do you think of it? Jeremiah whispered. It's a lovely house, Moira said. Shush. Here she comes, Jeremiah said as the old lady flung the front door open and stepped through. Moira moved toward her. Hello, Moira, the old lady said. Moira put her hand out to shake, and the old lady grabbed it with both hands. I'm so happy to have you here. Millie's pale blue eyes were startling, and they were the first things that Moira saw when she looked at Millie. Millie was also a lot shorter than Moira, with a solid frame and white wispy hair that had escaped from the prayer cap framing her face. Millie looked past Moira, releasing her hand to smile at Jeremiah. Hello. Hello, Aunt. Bring Moira's things in, and take them to the room at the back of the house. Sure thing. Millie took hold of Moira's hand once again and led her inside. Do you like cats? Yeah, I do. Good. Millie opened a bedroom door and showed Moira all her cats. They were mostly tabbies, but one was orange and white. They were all strays who found their way here. They're lovely. Do they stay in this room? No, they have the run of the house. I just wasn't sure whether you liked them or not, so I put them in here. You don't have to do anything like that, Moira said. Just live how you would normally and I'll fit in with you. Ack, you are such a lovely girl. Look at you with your fair hair and skin. Now let's have some cookies. Where's that nephew of mine? Here I am, Aunt Millie. Millie swung around. We're going to have cookies in the kitchen. Would you be staying for dinner, Jeremiah? No, I'd better get back home. I'll have some of your cookies to take with me. Millie smiled and turned to Moira. Jeremiah loves my cookies. Jeremiah and Moira followed Millie to the kitchen. I see you met all the cats, Jeremiah said to Moira. Yeah, they're all lovely. See, Jeremiah, some people like my cats, Millie said. I didn't say that I didn't like them. There are just a lot of them, and they're in the house. Millie replied, You and your father have 2 dogs in your house, so you shouldn't say anything about my cats. Cats are a lot cleaner than dogs. Well, I don't know about that, Jeremiah said. Now sit down and be quiet or you'll have no cookies. I said I'm not staying, Jeremiah said. You're staying, Millie said firmly. Jeremiah smiled at Moira, and both he and Moira sat at the kitchen table. Do you live far from here, Jeremiah? Moira asked. No, just a short walk that way. He pointed in a northerly direction. After they had coffee and cookies, Moira stood at the door and waved goodbye to Jeremiah. Millie walked up and stood next to her. Well, I hope you know what you've gotten yourself in for. Moira swung around to look at Millie. In regard to what? Teaching all those children. All those? How many are there? Close on 40 of them. Really? I was told that there were only 30 people in the community, and around 20 children. There are only about 5 Amish families, and then there are the other families in the area. Moira's face fell. She'd assumed that the bishop had only intended for her to teach the children in the Amish community. She didn't know she'd be teaching English children as well. I suppose someone has to do it, Millie said. Yeah, someone has to do it. Moira smiled. I did want an adventure, but I'm not sure that this was what I was after. That's a lot of children for one teacher. Millie giggled. Looking for an adventure, were you? Most girls your age are looking for a husband. Moira raised her eyebrows. I've seen what being married is like. I've got 2 older sisters. Days filled with chores, not a moment to yourself. Living the same day every day, a continuous stream of monotony stretching forth until the welcoming hands of death snatch you from the earth. Millie laughed once more. You're just like me when I was younger. Come and talk to me while I finish up cooking the dinner. Now the cats were out of the room and meowing around Moira's feet. If she was just like Millie had been when at a younger age, Moira wondered if she would end up the way Millie was now, living alone with a house full of meowing cats and looking forward to entertaining strangers. Millie did seem to be happy, so Moira didn't think it would be too bad if she did end up like Millie. You never married, Millie? You don't mind if I call you Millie, do you? Yeah, please call me Millie. No, I never married. I came close once, but I let Abel go. Abel wanted to marry me, but there was another girl in love with him. I let her have him. Moira frowned. Why would you do that? Millie laughed. It wasn't important to me at the time. I was a little bit like you. I didn't want what I could see that everyone else had. I wanted something different. Moira was delighted to find another person who thought the same way she did. Are you happy with how things turned out? I regret not marrying Abel. It's a funny thing. What is? His wife died, and I waited for what I considered a suitable time, and I was sure he'd come calling after a few years. I wanted my second chance with him and a second chance at being a wife. What happened? He married someone else without giving me a second thought. He'd totally forgotten me. Moira could see Millie's pale blue eyes brim with tears. I don't know about love, Moira said. Neither do I, it seems. How could he be in love with me, marry someone else, and when she died, give no thought to me and instead marry someone completely different? Was the love he had for me at first real? Is any love real, or is it only imagined? Millie's eyes bore right through Moira, as if Moira held the answer. I have no idea. I really don't. Millie turned back to the stove. Do you regret not marrying him first off, when you had the chance? Moira asked. Millie's mouth turned down. So the answer is yeah? Moira asked. Millie chortled. No, I don't regret it. Things happen how they are meant to happen. Now let's speak on something happy. Moira was amazed that she would have such an intimate conversation with a woman she'd only just met. Yet it seemed like she'd known Millie for a long time. She looked at Millie, and then looked around the sparsely furnished room. You have a lovely home. I've never seen anything quite like it. It's a nice home and it's a nice town. Small, but I like it. For how long have you had the cats? When I moved in here, there was a cat here. I think that the previous owners left him here. Oh, that's sad. Yeah, it is. Then one by one the other cats came, and they stayed. They were all strays. Moira laughed. They must have heard how good your place was and word got around. It seems so. Now tell me, do you like all kinds of food, or is this something that you won't eat? I eat everything. I don't think there's any food that I don't like. You're the same as me then. 2 cats continued to purr around Moira's feet. She bent down to pat one of them, but it jumped back and hissed at her. That one is Fang. You can't pat him, he doesn't like people. He was purring around my legs, Moira said. It's okay for him to go up to you, but he doesn't like people to touch him. I see, and what about the others? All the others are fine. You can pick them up, you can pat them, you can do anything with them, but not Fang. Moira looked at Fang, who was now staring at her as if she'd done something horrid to him. I guess someone must have scared him at one point before he came here. Maybe. He is my latest addition. I've had him for about a year. After dinner, Moira helped Millie clean up the kitchen, in the process learning where everything was kept. After seeing Moira yawn quite a few times, Millie said, Don't feel you have to stay up and talk to me to be polite. You look tired. Go to bed. Thank you, I just might do that. It's been a long couple of days, Moira said. You go then, I'll finish up here. No, I'll help you, and then I'll go to bed. When Moira finally pushed open her bedroom door, she was sure that the sight of the bed was the sweetest thing she'd ever seen. She whipped off her prayer cap, changed into her nightgown, and slid between the covers. She closed her eyes, pleased that her adventure had begun. Her mind drifted to when she used to share a bedroom with Hazel. They liked nothing more than to huddle in bed and talk about boys. They'd name the boys they liked. Moira had always insisted that she would marry Tom Miller. Now the chances of her marrying Tom were remote. There was never any scarcity of men, and Moira had a handful she could have chosen from if she had wanted to get married. She was sure that in Coulson County there would also be men to choose from if she changed her mind and chose to marry. Jeremiah seemed a nice man. Even though she'd just met him, there was something that seemed genuine about him. Moira's sister Hazel was happy in the life that she'd chosen. She was pleased with Stephen, her home, and how she had a baby. Moira tried to think back to the point where she began to want a different life. She was certain it was when Hazel got married, and Moira saw that Hazel's life was going to turn out exactly like Miriam's. There were no surprises with marriage. There were the same chores, babies and more babies, and then the certain death that awaits everyone. Moira often wondered why God had people live on the earth if they were only going to die at some point anyway. It was all futile. Whenever Moira had shared her concerns, not even the bishop had answers for her, except for something about God sorting the wheat from the chaff. Moira wasn't scared of dying, even though she thought about it often. What she was scared of was making wrong choices in regard to living. She figured that there were no choices in dying, but with living, choices were vital. All right for some, Moira said out aloud, and then she wasn't sure what she meant. Maybe she thought too much about things. She was glad to escape her old life, and she was nervous and excited about what the next day might bring. She said a silent prayer of thanks to God for Millie. Moira knew that God had found this special woman for her to stay with. Millie understood Moira. Millie was relaxed and funny, and she was not a stickler for shoulds and should-nots, like many of the older ladies Moira had come into contact with in her old community. Chapter 5. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. James chapter 1 verse 12. Early the next morning, Mrs. Pettigrew, a prominent member of the Coulsons County community, visited Moira. Mrs. Pettigrew was an Englisher, and had appointed herself as chairman of the school board. Moira guessed Mrs. Pettigrew must be approximately 60 years of age. Her graying brown hair was pulled severely off her face and secured into a bun at the back of her head. Her face was surprisingly free of wrinkles. It was only her graying hair and her slumped shoulders which told the truth of her age. Mrs. Pettigrew had introduced herself to Millie, who promptly let her in. "I know your son, the doctor," Millie said to her. "Everyone knows my son," Mrs. Pettigrew said as she stepped through the doorway. When she laid eyes on Moira, she said, "And this must be Moira. We're all delighted that you could come here." Mrs. Pettigrew stretched out her hand and Moira shook it. "Thank you, Mrs. Pettigrew. I'm delighted that I could help out. Why don't you two make yourselves comfortable in the living room, and I'll make myself scarce. Better yet, I'll make us some coffee," Millie said. "Thank you, Millie," Moira said as she showed Mrs. Pettigrew to the living room. Mrs. Pettigrew went on to describe the school hours and made mention of Moira's wage. Moira had never expected such a sum. She'd only expected enough to cover food and lodgings. She tried to cover her surprise. Mrs. Pettigrew apologized for such a small sum and told her that once the numbers of the school grew, Moira would be paid more. Moira assured her that she was happy with how things were, and gently suggested that should more children attend, it might be more prudent to think of employing an extra teacher. Moira wondered how she would properly teach so many children of all different ages. It would be a large task. "I'm looking forward to beginning," Moira said. "We'll officially start school on Monday then," Mrs. Pettigrew said. "I'll send word out to the parents to have their children there at 9 sharp." Moira smiled over at Millie, who had entered the room with a tray of coffee. After Millie passed both of each of them a cup of the steaming brew, she sat on the other end of the couch. Mrs. Pettigrew continued, "Every 3 months we'll have a meeting of the school board. You will be required to attend, and give us a progress report on the children." Moira nodded. "Certainly, and I'll assess each child's ability when we begin." "Excellent," Mrs. Pettigrew said as she brought the china coffee cup to her lips. She took a delicate sip of coffee, then replaced her cup back down onto a matching saucer. "I think you'll do just fine. Your bishop has made an excellent choice." "Thank you," Moira said. "Have you seen the schoolhouse?" Mrs. Pettigrew asked. "No, I haven't." "Do you want to go there with me? I'll show you now." "I'd love to see it." Mrs. Pettigrew looked across at Millie. "Would you like to come too?" "No, I think I'll stay behind," Millie answered. When they finished their coffee, Moira went with Mrs. Pettigrew to see where she would be teaching. It was a brand new brick building. "As you can see, there's plenty of room for the children to run around." "Yes. There's plenty of open space here." The older lady reached into her pocket and handed Moira a key. "Here you are, you might as well have this now. It's a key to the school." Moira could not keep a smile from spreading across her face as she looked down at the key now in her hand. She walked up the 5 steps to the front door, pushed the key into the lock and turned it. She stepped into the room to see that it was big enough to house 100 children, or even 200 children. School benches and desks were lined up in rows. She turned around and looked at Mrs. Pettigrew. "It must have taken some time to get all this together." Mrs. Pettigrew nodded. "Everyone worked on it together, even those in your Amish community. You're putting a lot of trust in me. I won't let you or your board down." Moira blinked back tears as she spoke. "We consider ourselves lucky to have you. You came highly recommended to us. And now that I've met you, I feel more than confident." "Thank you." Moira moved ahead and looked over every inch of the schoolroom. "We have the wash house out the back," Mrs. Pettigrew informed her. "I can't think what else there is to tell you. The slates and chalk are in here." She opened a large chest. Moira looked in to see all the school supplies. "It's just like the school back home where my friend Elsa is the teacher. There's a larger Amish community there, but fewer children. Not like here, where everyone will be taught together." "Ah, someone said you'd be here." Moira and Mrs. Pettigrew turned around when they heard the loud, deep voice. "Moira, meet my son, Nathan Pettigrew." Moira stepped forward and stretched out her hand. He took it and gave it a hearty shake. "Miss Shantz, I presume?" he asked. Before Moira could answer, Mrs. Pettigrew said, "This is Moira Shantz." "It's very nice to meet you," he said. Moira smiled as she studied him, noting his dark skin and dark eyes. "Please call me Moira." "Nathan is on the school board." "He's a doctor," Mrs. Pettigrew said. "I see," Moira said, a little disappointed at the thought that he was most likely married and had children if he was on the school board. "You have children?" He laughed. "No, I don't. I'm not married. He's a confirmed bachelor, my son is." "Mother, I don't think that's true." He looked back at Moira. "Just never met the right lady." His mother scoffed and then covered it with a polite cough. "Did you come here to meet Moira, or did you want me for something?" she asked. "I came here to meet our new school teacher. We've all been anxiously waiting your arrival. Everyone is pleased to have a full-time teacher. If we couldn't find a suitable person, we had a couple of parents who were going to step in until we could get someone, but it's preferable to have a proper and a permanent teacher." Moira wondered what he meant by a proper teacher. She'd done well in her schoolings, and the teachers were normally taken from the best of the students. "I'll do my very best, you can be assured of that," Moira said. He smiled at her, and Moira could tell that he liked what he saw. Even though she had never properly dated a man, she knew when a man liked the look of her. "Why don't I show you around our town?" he said to Moira. He looked at his mother. "That is, if you finished with Moira for the day, Mother?" Mrs. Pettigrew stepped toward them. "I just wanted to show her the school, and then I was going to take her back to where she's staying." "I can take you back, Moira. That is, if you'd like to see the town." Moira glanced at Mrs. Pettigrew, and then looked back at the smiling eyes of the handsome doctor. "I'd like to see the town before I start teaching. It will give me a better idea of my students." "Excellent," Nathan said. Moira said goodbye to Mrs. Pettigrew, and when the older woman had gone on her way, Moira locked the schoolhouse, pleased to have possession of the key. The handsome doctor was still by her side. She looked up at him. Your buggy awaits, he said. She gave a little laugh, pleased to have made a new friend even though he was an Englisher. The doctor drove Moira around the countryside, showing her many places and sharing many entertaining stories. When Moira mentioned that Millie might be wondering where she was, Nathan turned to her. I think you'll be good for this place, Moira. We need someone young and vibrant around these parts. Thank you. I'll get you back to Millie's place. He turned the buggy around to head to Millie's house. You know Millie? Moira asked him. Everyone knows nearly everyone in this town. I guess you'd get to meet everyone anyway, since you're the doctor. He turned to her and gave her a smile which made her feel uneasy yet at the same time warmed her insides. A lot of people still use their own remedies and don't trust modern medicine. Moira nodded, thinking of all the herbs and concoctions that had been passed down in her family to treat everything from a bad bruise to a fever. I guess that's so. When he stopped in front of Millie's house, he jumped down to help her out. As she stepped down, he asked, Can I call on you again soon? Not that I called on you this time. He cleared his throat. What I meant to say was, would you mind if I called on you? I'd like to see you again soon. Moira nodded. I'd like that. As soon as she'd said the words, she wondered if she should have refused his offer. If she had said no, it would have seemed most unfriendly. He was a member of the school board and therefore was one of her employers. She reminded herself of this to help herself feel better about agreeing to see him again. Would you care to come inside? He glanced across at the house. It appears that Millie's got visitors, and by the looks of the buggy, I'd say it's her sister. Really? I haven't met her yet. He leaned over and whispered, Normally I'd walk you to the door, but I don't want to get trapped if you know what I mean. Of course. I imagine you're a busy person. That's it. He jumped up into his buggy. I'll see you soon, Moira. Moira waved goodbye and then made her way to the house. When she opened the door, she saw Millie's sister sitting on the couch. It had to be her since she looked exactly like Millie, only younger. Millie's look-alike sprang to her feet and walked over to Moira. You have to be Moira. Moira smiled at the woman, who even had the same friendliness as Millie. That's right, and you must be Selma. Selma giggled. Come sit with me. She pulled Moira over to the couch. Now sit and tell me all about yourself, and when you finish that, you can tell me what you were doing with Nathan Pettigrew. Selma giggled again, but this time she covered her mouth with her hand. Moira couldn't help but laugh along with Selma. Millie interrupted them by bringing in a tray of coffee and cake. We saw you through the window. I thought you'd invite him in. I did, but he had some important doctor things to do, Moira said. Okay, it's just us for coffee then, Millie said, placing the tray on the low table next to the couch. I see you two have met already. They both nodded. Chapter 6. Wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labor shall increase. Proverbs chapter 13 verse 11. Moira rolled out of bed with a sense of excitement bubbling within. It was the grand opening of Coulson County School. She had left her home and moved to Coulson County, and had gotten the position of schoolteacher solely on the word of the bishop. Knowing that she couldn't let the school board or the bishop down made her extra nervous. There were a lot of people relying on her to succeed. Teaching was one thing that she'd always held in high regard. Moira quickly got dressed and readied her bag of supplies and books. She had spent the entire night preparing, and was more than ready to meet her new students. She made herself a quick breakfast before Millie woke, and then she took off up the road to walk the 1 mile to the school. When Moira arrived, she smiled, knowing that before long there would be children everywhere. The small building was set nestled atop a very small hill. The ground surrounding the school softened into flat terrain with plenty of room for the children to play. She had 2 hours to fill in, so she went inside and went through her teaching plans. When 9 o'clock grew close, Millie stood on the front steps to await her students. She looked up at the warm sun as its rays shone down on her and filled her with the warmth of anticipation. The minutes were counting down, and the thought of finally beginning her career as a teacher caused her to smile incessantly without even realizing it. She wondered how many children would show up, and whether they would have as many as they had expected. Her heart beat fast when she saw 2 small black buggies heading up the road to the school building. Around the same time, Moira also saw several students walking up the street toward the school. As the first buggy opened its door, a chubby boy and his mother climbed down and approached her as other wagons and buggies began to fill the road. "Good morning," Moira greeted them. "Good morning," the mother replied. "What a lovely day for the school to be opening, is it not?" "It sure is," Moira replied, her smile never leaving her lips. "I'm Miss Shantz," she said, introducing herself to the mother first and then turning to the little boy. "I'm Philip," the boy said. "Lovely to meet you, Philip. The other children will be here shortly," she said, looking at the boy. "You can either go find a seat inside, or you can play out in the yard until it's time to begin. I'll sound a bell when class is to start." "Okay," the boy blurted, running to greet several other children that approached. "He's just a bit excited to finally be able to get out of the house and be around other kids," his mother explained. "That is entirely understandable," Moira said. "I think it will be a change of pace for most of the students, but in a good way. Our primary objective is to give these children a good education. At least to have them all be able to read well. That will make a big impact on the town in the long run." "I think so too," the mother added. "That's why my husband and I have supported this project from the very beginning. I think you'll find that many other families think the same. We just want a better life for our children. If education can help them achieve that, then we're all for it." Moira nodded as the woman smiled and waved, then Moira turned to speak to some of the other parents. She made the rounds, greeting each new arrival and introducing herself. Many of the first to arrive were Amish, she could tell by their clothing and their Germanic last names. The next few people to arrive were Englishers. Moira tried hard to remember all their names and tried to get used to being called Miss Shantz. After the clock struck 9, she said goodbye to the parents and sounded the little bell that rested on her desk. The chatter that erupted was almost soothing to her ears as the children piled into the classroom. "Take your seats," she called out firmly. Elsa had told Moira to keep her voice confident and have a no-nonsense tone. Elsa had also told Moira not to ask them to do anything. She had to tell them to do whatever it is that she wanted. "It's like training a pet," Elsa had said. "You have to be firm and show no sign of weakness." The students filled the benches up quickly and sat patiently awaiting their new teacher's directions. Moira walked over to the blackboard, which was pine wood that had been painted black. She wrote Miss Shantz on the board, then proceeded to hand out individual slates to each of the students. "Hello students, my name is Miss Shantz," she explained, pointing to the large board. "I'll be passing out these slates for each of you to use for your work." The first thing she wanted to do was to see where each student was in regard to his or her reading level and numeracy skills. They had all been taught in their homes up until now. "Excuse me," said one of the older students in the back of the classroom. Moira looked up. "Yes? Would you like help passing those out?" the girl asked. Moira smiled at the kind offer. "That would be a great help." "Thank you," she said, handing half of the slates to the girl. They passed them out to each student, along with a piece of chalk to write with. Moira wrote several questions on the board, then asked the children to write down their answers on their slates. After a long bombardment of questions and answers, Moira had a better understanding of each of her students' learning abilities and needs. She used a quill to take notes in her personal notebook. As the day crawled on, she realized that her job was going to be a bit more stressful than she had expected. She'd counted 38 students. It wasn't a number that would be impossible to handle, but for a new teacher at a brand new school, the prospect was overwhelming. There were so many children, she decided to have them all wear name tags for the first few weeks until she remembered them all. As the end of the first school day neared, Moira looked out over the happy faces of her students. The older kids were helping some of the younger ones with their first assignment, writing out the ABCs. She had gone over them several times, and then sprang a surprise quiz to see how many of the younger children could remember and recite the alphabet. Even though it was a simple task, the results filled her with hope. Moira had counted 4 students who had never learned their ABCs and several who knew them, but not perfectly. Now the entire class recited it together before it was time to dismiss them. "I hope you all have a wonderful day of learning," Moira said, ringing the final bell to free the students from their first day at Coulson County School. The stroll back to Millie's house gave Moira just enough time to calm her mind after the buzzing day. When the house came into view, she saw Millie and Millie's sister Selma sitting on the porch with cats on their laps. She waved to them and they waved back. "How was it?" Millie yelled out. "Busy and rowdy," Moira said. "I don't know how they expect one person to handle all those children, but still, I guess I can do it when I get organized." "The first day is most likely the worst," Selma said. Millie pushed the cat off her lap, stood up and reached out her hand to Moira. "Come, my girl. I'll make us a nice cup of coffee and some of those chocolate biscuits that you like." "Oh, that sounds delightful," Moira said. Moira told Millie and Selma nearly everything about her day, while the cat that didn't like to be touched, Fang, purred around her legs. "Sounds like you had an enjoyable time," Millie said. "It was enjoyable. This is what I left Earl Town for. I left the life I had back there for something new and exciting, and I found it. I have a chance to make the lives of all these children a little bit better, and a little bit richer. That must be a good feeling." "You have a calling then," Millie said. "I guess I do. I guess this is what God meant for me to do. Not get married and have children. He meant for me to teach." "There is nothing stopping you from doing both, you know," Selma said. "I don't think I could do the two things well. My father always said that if a job's worth doing, then it's worth doing well. I don't think I could do the two of those things well. I can only do one thing at a time." "What about the handsome doctor?" Selma asked with her eyes sparkling. Moira scrunched up her nose. "He's an Englisher." "You're after adventure, aren't you?" Millie asked. "I didn't mean that type of adventure, Millie." Selma raised her eyebrows. "You never know what God's got in store for you." "I'm surprised to hear you say that. Do you think he'd join the Amish or something? Anyway, you never got married, Millie, so why do you think that might be in God's plan for me to marry?" Moira was a little annoyed. She didn't leave her nagging family to be nagged by Selma or Millie. Selma said, "Life goes past fast. You don't know that because you're young. You can't get back your youth once it's gone, Moira. The childbearing years go past so quickly, and that's an opportunity you can't get back." Selma continued, "I don't know if Millie told you, but I got married late and then he died. I don't have children." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Sorry to hear both of those things," Moira said. Moira was sad for Selma, but at the same time she was tired of people telling her that she didn't understand things because she was young. That was something that she didn't want to hear again. "I'm only being helpful, trying to be helpful anyway. Sometimes I feel sad, but I've got too many nieces and nephews, so many that I can barely count them, and I'm certain there'll be more coming." Selma sighed. "As long as you're aware of what I'm saying, I won't say any more about it." Moira pulled her mouth to one side and set her eyes on Millie. "You know how I feel, don't you, Millie? I thought you'd be one person who would understand me. My friend Elsa understands me, and I thought you would too." "So is your friend also unmarried then?" Millie asked. "Yeah, she's a teacher like me. She has no desire to marry, and neither do I. We've talked about it many times." "There's nothing wrong with that decision if that's really what you want," Selma said. "Selma and I don't want you to look back and be sorry for your decisions," Millie said. "I can't live my life like that though, Millie. What if I got married and had children, and then I looked back and I was sorry that I got married at all? I think I just have to do what feels right at this very moment. If I have regrets later, I'll just put them out of my mind." "You're a very strong woman, Moira, very strong," Millie said. Moira was so involved with making her point to Millie and Selma that she forgot she wasn't supposed to pet Fang. She reached down to touch him and he bit her on the hand. Moira let out a yell and looked at her hand to see blood dripping. "He bit me." Selma hid her face behind her hands. "I can't look." Millie jumped up. "Go outside and run it under the tap. I'll find some dressings." Moira rushed outside and put her hand under the running water. Millie followed her outside with clean strips of cotton. "It's just a little cut, but it's bleeding a lot," Moira said. "Give it to me and I'll wrap it in this." Moira pulled back her hand. "No, there's no need." "All the same," Millie insisted. "I'll wrap it in this. Unless you'd rather have me call the doctor." Millie raised her eyebrows and her blue eyes twinkled, causing Moira to laugh. "Okay. Wrap up my hand. Anyone home?" At the sound of a male voice, Moira swung around in surprise. It sounded awfully like the handsome doctor. Moira's eyes fixed on Millie. Millie called out, "We're out in the back." Seconds later, the doctor, Nathan Pettigrew, was standing in front of them with his hands on his hips, grinning. "Good evening, Dr. Pettigrew. How do you like my bandage work?" Millie asked him with a laugh in her voice. "What have you done to yourself, Moira?" "It wasn't my fault. A cat attacked me." Nathan laughed. "A cat? Are you sure it wasn't a large mountain lion?" "It might have been, come to think of it." Moira looked at her hand, and saw how ridiculous the cotton wrapping must have looked to him. "It was a very vicious cat," she insisted. "There was lots of blood." "I've just put on a pot of coffee, Dr. Pettigrew. Would you like some?" Millie asked. "I'd be delighted if that's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Millie said. "You two come in when you're good and ready." Nathan turned back to Moira. "I came to see how your first day was." "It was very, very busy, but extremely satisfying. The children are all wonderful and so polite. There was not one cross word spoken all day from anyone." "Glad to hear it," he said. He lowered his voice. "I do admit there is another reason I came to see you." "Apart from laughing at my injury?" she asked, holding up her hand. "Yes, apart from that. I came to ask if you might accompany me to dinner this coming Saturday night. I thought I'd ask now in case you got booked up with other engagements." Moira was a little shocked. She hadn't expected to be asked out on a date. Seeing the town with him was one thing, as he was a member of the school board, but going out on a date was another thing entirely. It wasn't a good idea, and she knew it. She found herself nodding. "Is that a yes?" he asked. Chapter 7. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans chapter 12 verse 2. Yes. She had to force out the words. She had just agreed to go on a date with the handsome Dr. Nathan Pettigrew. Her head was spinning as the words spoken at nearly every gathering came into her mind. The Amish were to keep separate from people who weren't Amish, or they would be at risk of being led into a world of unrighteousness. Now that she was away from her family and from the community where she had felt stifled, she knew she should make her own decisions while not departing from her faith. Surely a little time alone with the doctor wouldn't do any harm. "I'm glad," he said. "Now let me see what's happening with your injury." He hastily unwrapped the cotton makeshift bandages, and saw that the feline's teeth had penetrated quite deeply. "Ah, we're going to need to put something on that. Would Millie have any iodine?" "I'm not sure. I think I might have seen some in her utility room." "Don't go anywhere," he said. She watched as Nathan walked through the back door of the house. Something about him made her feel safe. He returned with a small bottle of iodine. "Hold still," he ordered as he took off the cap. Tingles ran up Moira's spine as she felt his fingers holding her hand. "They're all done. Now I'll wrap it back up, trying to do a better job than Millie did. After all, I'm a professional." Moira giggled. When he had finished bandaging her hand with a cleverly structured style of wrapping, she said, "Let's go and get that coffee now." He followed her into the house where they chatted politely with Millie and Selma about cats. The days passed quickly, and then before Moira knew it, it was Saturday. Moira was getting ready for her date with the English doctor. She had told no one, apart from Millie and Selma, that she had a date. She hadn't written of it in her letters to home. If she'd been at home, she'd surely have told Elsa and her closest sister Hazel. They would have giggled and talked about it for hours. She bathed and dressed in her nicest dress, and then waited for him in the living room, sharing the couch with 3 outstretched sleeping cats. "Here he comes," Millie hissed. Moira smiled when she saw the excitement on Millie's face. Millie seemed to be way more excited than Moira was. "Don't wait up," Moira said. "I can't promise that. I want to hear all about it." "He's so handsome," Millie whispered. Moira shook her head. Millie was just like a younger woman. She wasn't stuffy like most of the older women Moira knew back at home. Nathan knocked on the door, and Millie made sure that she was the one to answer it. "Come in," she said. Just at that moment, Moira approached the door. "I'm ready," she said. "Well, let's go." They walked to his small black buggy, which was drawn by his shiny black horse. He helped her step up into the buggy. "I hope you don't mind where I'm taking you," he said. "Where's that?" "I was going to take you out for a quiet dinner, just the two of us, but I was just asked to dinner by a visiting doctor and his wife. They're only in town this weekend." Moira smiled, pleased to be included. "No, I don't mind at all." "Good. I'll make it up to you. I hope they don't bore you too much. I mostly have dinner with them when they're in town. Things start off okay, and then they usually drink far too much." "You're not a drinker?" she asked. "I have the occasional drink with a meal, but I'm not one to drink for the sake of it." They pulled up in town and Moira was ushered into a very fancy restaurant where she felt out of place and very underdressed. They sat down at a table set for 4. "I guess they aren't here yet. I hope we don't have to wait too long for them." "I'm a little hungry," Nathan said, looking toward the entrance. "Ah, here they are." When the pair was nearly at the table, Nathan stood, leaned across, and shook the older gentleman's hand. Then Nathan nodded at the doctor's wife and introduced them both to Moira. Once they were all seated, Nathan explained, "Moira is the new schoolteacher." "How do you enjoy that, Moira?" the doctor's wife asked. Moira looked across at the lady who'd been introduced as Marjorie. Marjorie had diamonds on nearly every finger, and her earlobes sagged from the weight of gold and precious gems. Moira considered that the woman's dress was very low in the front, and she wondered how a woman could put herself on display like that. But she pulled her attention away from the low-cut dress and back to the question. "I like it very much. I've just finished my first full week." She smiled at Marjorie while feeling even more out of place. Maybe it was a mistake to go out with an Englisher. This was not her world or her lifestyle. Marjorie and Moira talked while the two men talked about their work. Moira struggled to find something in common with Marjorie to speak on. After a while, Moira noticed that Nathan had been right about the drinking, and it wouldn't have mattered what Moira had been talking about. As soon as they had finished their meal, Nathan made excuses and he and Moira left before the other couple. "They'll stay there drinking for another couple of hours," Nathan said. "I thought we should escape as soon as we could." Moira smiled, thankful they were leaving the other couple behind. "Have you ever seen so many diamonds?" Nathan asked Moira. Moira giggled. I'm sure she had enough diamonds to feed a small country. I'd say that would be the truth. He helped Moira up into his buggy. When he got into the driver's seat, he said, "Let's have a little drive about before I take you back to Millie's place." "Okay. I'm sorry about tonight. It's hardly given you a good impression of me. I don't talk about work all the time." "Your work is very important," Moira insisted. "Tonight should have been just the two of us. Will you let me make it up to you? Will you let me take you somewhere next Saturday, just the two of us?" Moira nodded. The night hadn't been too bad, and he seemed as though he was a nice person. "I'd like that," she said. "Good. How about I call for you earlier in the day? Say mid-afternoon and I'll show you my house." "Sounds good." Nathan drove her back to Millie's house and walked her to the door. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," he said. "Thank you for inviting me, Nathan." She opened the door quickly, hoping to avoid an awkward goodbye moment. Moira closed the door behind her and waited until she heard his buggy drive away from the house before she took another step. "He's gone," she heard Millie say. "Millie, where are you?" Suddenly, a lamp in the corner of the living room was lit to reveal that Millie was sitting on the couch. "I thought you'd be in bed." "The house was in darkness," Moira said. "No, I had to hear what happened," Millie said. Moira sat down next to her. "There were other people at the dinner, so we didn't talk much to each other, but we're seeing each other again next Saturday." "Ah, that's good. Do you like him?" "I do. I like him very much. He seems kind and has a gentle way about him." "Will you feel up to going to the gathering tomorrow?" Millie asked. "Yeah, I'd love to meet everyone. I've met some people already, but I'm looking forward to meeting the others." Millie rose to her feet. "Well, we'd better get an early night because we've got an early start in the morning." Moira went to bed happy and feeling satisfied. She'd done something different. She'd gone out to dinner and met some people she never would have met if she'd stayed in Earltown. Chapter 8. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5. The next morning, Milly and Moira were collected in Jeremiah's father's wagon. Jeremiah introduced Moira to his father, Joseph, and his younger brothers and sisters. Moira was happy to see Jeremiah's friendly face once more. The gathering was held at the parents' home of one of her schoolchildren. All Moira's Amish students were there. Moira scanned all the older children to see if there might be a suitable girl who would make an assistant. Things would be easier if she had someone to assist her. The assistant could listen to the younger children read while she helped the older children. Of course, she'd have to run her idea past the school board, but she thought they'd agree. Most of the people in the community were young couples with young families. There were also a few much older folk around Milly's age. Jeremiah was the only single man in the community who was around Moira's age, early to mid-20s. There were two younger girls who Moira noticed, who were about 18. She wondered if either of these girls might be suitable to help her with her students. She noticed Jeremiah walking over to her. "Have you met everyone yet?" he asked. "Yeah, most of them. I'm wondering if either of those two girls might be able to help me with my students. It was just an idea I had. I haven't talked to the people in charge yet," Moira said. Jeremiah shook his head. "If either of them would have been suitable, they wouldn't have had to send for you." I didn't think of that. Neither of them can write." Moira raised her eyebrows. Many people couldn't write or read, but Moira's parents had always made sure that all their children could read properly. They could come to the school and learn. Jeremiah smiled. "They don't need to learn anything. They'll be married before long, I dare say. The taller one, Jennifer, is betrothed to a man from another community, and the other one is her sister, and she's making eyes at Jennifer's soon-to-be husband's brother." Moira knew reading and writing weren't that important to a lot of people. Some older folk couldn't read at all, and some could read a little just so they could get by. "Well, that's my good idea gone. Sorry to be the one to break it to you, but I think you're on your own, unless you can get one of the parents to help out now and again." "I guess that's a good idea. I'll see if I can organize that." A cold wind sweeping across the fields caused Moira to shiver. "It's much colder here than at home, and it can get mighty cold at home." "Did you bring a coat with you?" Jeremiah asked. Moira shook her head. "I didn't think I'd need it." "I'll get my coat for you." "No, I'll just go inside by the fire." "I'll come with you," he said. Jeremiah stayed close by Moira until the meal served after the gathering was over. She was glad of his company. Milly and Moira were taken back home mid-afternoon. Jeremiah asked her if she would go out on a ride with him in the afternoon, and she said she would go. She really liked Jeremiah, and had gotten to know him quite well on their drive back to Coulson County. While Milly went for a sleep, Moira went with Jeremiah. Although Moira liked Jeremiah very much, it was more of a friendship than a romance. She didn't want to have him think of her as a potential wife, so she made up her mind that she would be honest with him if the conversation were to lead in that direction. Jeremiah showed her all over the countryside, even though Nathan had already shown her. When he returned her to Milly's house, Moira was certain that Jeremiah was only interested in a friendship as well. Moira had already been in Coulson County for 6 months before she got her first letter from Elsa. That wasn't unusual, as the mail was slow, and Moira knew that Elsa was busy with her students. Elsa told her that Tom and she were developing a close friendship. She knew Elsa well enough to know what the letter meant. It was a Wednesday afternoon, school was over for the day, and she sat on the porch with the letter in her lap. "Bad news?" She looked up to see Milly with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered one to Moira. "Kind of," she said as she took the cup from Milly. "Kind of the worst news ever." Milly sat next to her. Moira continued, "My best friend in the world, Elsa, has just told me that she and Tom are becoming friendly." "My Tom? Well, he was my Tom." "Yeah, I remember you telling me of Tom. What are you going to do about it?" Moira took a sip of the hot coffee. "I don't see what I can do. I made a choice when I left. I'm surprised that Elsa is thinking of marriage because she used to think the same as me. This letter is telling you that they're getting serious toward each other? Moira nodded. I've always been in love with Tom Miller, but I left him to come here. Did he know you were in love with him? Moira shrugged. I think so. He asked me to marry him shortly before I left. I said no, and then I made him promise not to write to me. Well then he wouldn't know, would he? Millie tilted her head to the side and she frowned at Moira. They sat in silence for a time. Moira looked at Millie. It seems that I'm never satisfied. Now that I'm here I wish I was there, and I'm sure if I go back there I'd regret leaving. Even though Moira saw the doctor every couple of weeks for dinner and some other kind of outing, her heart still belonged to Tom. Sometimes life's like that. We want what we don't have, and when we get it, we don't value it and we want something else. So what you're saying is to be thankful for what we have right now. Millie giggled. Don't take my advice about anything. As I see it, you have two options at this point. You stay here or you go back and see if you can win Tom, if that's what you want. Now winning Tom means winning him away from Elsa, and I'm not sure that I'd want to do that. Moira realized now that Millie had been in a similar position when she let her friend have the man she loved. Moira had thought Millie shouldn't have let the man go, but here she was about to do a similar thing. Moira remained silent, but was sure that Millie was having the same thought. I never thought I'd get a letter like that. Well, I hoped I wouldn't get a letter like that. You didn't think that he'd remain single forever, did you? Just waiting until you were ready? Moira shrugged her shoulders and took another sip of coffee. She had to wait until she was ready and not get married out of fear that she would miss out on something. I'm all mixed up. Life's like that. There are no right answers sometimes. You have to do what you decide to do. No one can tell you that. Sure, you can listen to the advice of others, but you have to make your own choice because you're the only one who will live your life. I'm grateful she told me. Elsa. Moira nodded. I'd hate to read a letter that they'd gotten married. Now I can get used to the idea. Two cats came out of the house meowing. Moira and Millie turned to look at them. There's always cats, Millie said. I guess I'll have to go home for Christmas. Would you like to come with me? Me? Goodness no. Thank you for asking me, but I'm not one for large gatherings. My family gatherings are getting larger and larger. Now that everyone's married and they're all multiplying at a fast rate. How will it be when you see Tom and Elsa? Moira breathed in deeply. I have no idea how I will feel about them. I guess I'm happy for them. It's just strange because for the longest time, well, since I was small I always thought I'd marry Tom. Now you've got a whole lot more options open to you. There's Nathan and then there's my nephew. Moira smiled. Both men were kind, and anyone would love to find nice men like them, but Moira did not love them. If she had wanted to get married like all the other girls, she would have been happy to marry Jeremiah, since he was Amish and Nathan wasn't. Moira was certain that not having the burning desire to marry made her think about things more deeply than a lot of girls did. It'll be strange going back home again. I think I've grown up a lot since I left. Are you happy you made the decision to come here? Moira whipped her head around to look at Millie. Of course I am. Otherwise, I wouldn't have met you and all your cats. Millie's cheeks crinkled as she smiled. I enjoy having you here. I'll miss you while you're away. I'll miss you too, Millie. Chapter 9. Truly my soul waiteth upon God, from him cometh my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense, I shall not be greatly moved. Psalm chapter 62 verse 1. It was days before Christmas when Moira arrived home. She stepped out of the wagon and saw that the house looked deserted. Her family must have known from her letter that she was coming. She'd sent it in plenty of time to arrive before she did. She wondered why they weren't there waiting for her. She called out but no one answered. She pushed open the front door of the house and walked inside. There was food still on the stove. Moira could see that someone had left in a hurry. Her mother would never have left half-cooked food on the stove like that, unless it was some kind of emergency. Moira took her clothes up to her room and unpacked. They would no doubt be back later. Moira lay down on her old bed and closed her eyes. It was strange to be back, and stranger still to come back to an empty home. Even her 2 dogs hadn't been there to greet her. Moira must have fallen asleep, because the next thing she remembered is that she was being shaken awake. She opened her eyes to see Elsa. Elsa! She sat up and hugged Elsa. Elsa remained silent. Moira stopped hugging her. "What's wrong?" Moira asked. "It's Anna Stutzman, she just passed on to be with God." Moira's fingertips flew to her mouth and then tears fell from her eyes. Anna Stutzman had been like a second mother to Moira. For years Moira and her sister Hazel had spent every day at Anna's house making quilts for the needy. Elsa held Moira tightly while she sobbed. After a moment Moira asked why. How did she die? She had been sick for a while. God took her while she was having a rest. She was in her bed, she went to sleep and didn't wake up. Is that where everyone is? At the Stutzman's house? Yeah, everyone is there. Mr. Stutzman is not taking it well. Do you want to go over there? I'll take you there. They sent me here to wait for you and then bring you over. Moira sniffed back her tears and nodded. I'll just wash my face. It'll do no one any good to see me in a state like this. Moira stepped into her family's buggy, and Elsa drove her the short distance to Mr. Stutzman's house. This was not the reunion she was thinking she'd have with her family. And now, she'd never have a chance to speak to Mrs. Stutzman again. Moira held back her tears as she walked into the Stutzman's house and greeted everyone. They were all there, all the Shants and all the Stutzmans, every one of them. There was no crying or wailing, just silence, and even the babies were quiet. She knew she was going, Mr. Stutzman said. Days ago, she showed me the spot where she wanted to be buried. I told her she was speaking nonsense and had a long life to live, but she knew better than me. Where did she want to be buried? Moira's mother asked her dear friend's husband. Up on the rise there's a big tree with spreading branches. She wants to be buried under the tree. Moira was at least glad that she would be there for Mrs. Stutzman's funeral. That was something that she wouldn't like to have missed. It was 10 days before Christmas, and Moira knew that they would probably have Mrs. Stutzman buried soon, perhaps within a day or 2. Everyone in the community would pay their respects and say goodbye on the day of the funeral. This would be a very different Christmas than the ones they had been used to. It was late that night when Elsa and Moira finally returned home. This was so unexpected. She was sick when I left, but I didn't think she was sick enough to die. I would have liked someone to tell me, so I could have prepared myself for it, Moira said. No one knew that she was going to die except for her, going by what Mr. Stutzman said, Elsa answered. The next morning Moira got up before Elsa and went downstairs. Her mother was in the kitchen, baking bread. Moira sat down at the table, and her mother looked at her and smiled. It must be hard for you, Mom. You were so close to Anna, Moira said. I'll miss her, but death is a part of life. Yeah, I know it is. It doesn't mean that we don't miss those gone. Her mother nodded. Moira knew that her mother was putting on a brave front for everyone else. Mrs. Shant said, she was my dearest friend. Moira saw her mother wipe away a tear before she added, I'm glad you're back home. That gives me comfort. I'm glad to be here, Mom. Now tell me about everything. Her mother had just finished putting the loaves into the hot oven, and she sat down at the long wooden table. Come sit by me and tell me everything. The children are great. The school board is helpful, and they agree with whatever I ask them for. They're happy with how the children are progressing, and everything's going fine. Oh, I do wish you could meet Millie, the old lady I live with. She sounds like a lovely lady. Moira nodded. She's very different than most people. She has a lot of cats. There's this one cat who doesn't let anyone touch him. She noticed that her mother wasn't really listening. What are you thinking about, Mom? I'm just wondering if you've spoken to Tom lately. I know about Tom and Elsa. I haven't spoken to Elsa about Tom since I've been back, but she wrote and told me that she's been seeing a lot of Tom. She did? Moira saw a look of relief wash over her mother's face. Yeah, she told me. At that moment, Moira knew from the look on her mother's face that things between Elsa and Tom had escalated. Had they talked of marriage? Were they now betrothed? All of a sudden nothing else mattered, not her teaching, not her pupils, and not having a different life. Tom was the only man for her, and she'd let him slip through her fingers. Life was short and temporary, and that had been brought home to her by the sudden death of Anna Stutzman. Now Moira was in a pickle. If she told Tom how she felt about him, then she would very possibly ruin Elsa's life. She couldn't do that to her dear friend. It was at Mrs. Stutzman's funeral that Moira saw Tom. He walked toward her. "Hello, Moira." Moira smiled and could barely bring herself to speak. She squeaked out, "Hello, Tom." He smiled at her and then looked down at the ground. He had always been quiet and shy. He looked up. "It's good to see you. Everyone around here has missed you. I guess it's been a bit quieter without me." Tom chuckled. "You could say that. When are you heading back?" "School starts again 2 weeks after Christmas, so I'll be heading back before then." "How are you liking it in Colson County?" "It's quite different. There's only a small township there and fewer people." "I guess it was a shock to learn of Mrs. Stutzman's passing when you got back here." Moira nodded. "It happened on the very day I came home. No one was at the house, and I didn't know where everyone had gone. They knew I was arriving that day, and they sent Elsa to fetch me and take me to the Stutzman's house." Tom looked at the ground again. He cleared his throat and then looked up at her. "I guess you know about me and Elsa?" "I do. We both talked about it, and I thought it best she write to tell you. Thank you for letting me know. Otherwise, I would have arrived back here with 2 shocks." She looked at his worried face. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that. I mean, don't forget that I asked you, and you wouldn't even let me write to you. Do you remember that? I asked you to marry me." Moira nodded. Tom continued, "We always got along so well. I used to tell folk that I was going to marry you, and I heard that you did the same. I just expected that we'd be together someday." "Yeah, so did I. But then I left." "Yeah, you did." Moira took a deep breath and looked around. It was too much for her to bear. She'd lost the man she thought she'd marry, and now she couldn't tell him how she felt and win him back. If she won him back, that would mean that Elsa lost, and she couldn't see her friend unhappy. Things turn out how they're meant to. "Is that what you think?" Tom asked. "Yeah, that's what I have to think." "I see." Moira said, "We better join the others. They're about to lower her into the ground." Bishop John had said words at the Stutzman's house before the body had been taken in the wagon over to the tree that she wanted to be buried under. The entire Amish local community was there, as well as a large number of people from nearby communities. Tom made a sweep of his hand. "After you." Moira knew she'd have to put Tom right out of her mind. It would be far easier for her to forget him when she went back to Colson County, but first she'd have to get through Christmas and the holidays. Chapter 10. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 1. The days over the Christmas break were just like old times. Moira had fun with Elsa walking through the fields with their 2 dogs. Moira knew that Elsa was seeing a lot less of Tom than she normally would have if Moira hadn't been there. Both of them had not talked about Tom, and as far as Moira was concerned, she didn't want to know about Elsa's relationship with him. The first time Moira had spent the day at Miriam's house those holidays, she saw just how organized she was. She was far different from the young girl Moira remembered, who sat around moaning about having too much work to do. Everything at Miriam's house ran like clockwork, and it was all so neat and organized. Hazel was no different. She had a toddler who had taken to grabbing and pulling things off shelves. Hazel loved being a mother, and was planning for many more children as soon as she possibly could. Even Matthew and James had their own children, and Moira felt somewhat of an outsider even though she'd only been gone for a relatively short time. All the members of the Shantz families and the Stutzmans families were coming to Moira's parents' house for the Christmas midday meal. There was chicken, turkey, salads, a baked vegetable, and a huge array of dessert for after. The 2 dogs sat under the table, hoping for people to pass them snippets of food on the sly. Moira stared at the faces around the table. It seemed odd to see the Stutzman boys were all married. The youngest ones seemed far too young to be coupled up already. The families had increased so much in size that they now had to be spread across 2 large tables. When the children grew old enough to sit by themselves, they would have to sit at their own table. Moira began to count heads but lost count and had to start again. She was glad that her students didn't see her falter with her numbers. Moira longed to go back to Coulson County. That was where her home was now. She felt at home with Millie and the cats, and that's where her heart belonged. With Tom sweet on Elsa and Mrs. Stutzman gone, everything had changed. When everyone had gone home that night, Moira, Elsa and Mrs. Shantz were doing the last cleaning of the kitchen. "Moira, you haven't told us if you've met any men in Coulson County," her mother said. "There's Jeremiah King. You remember him, Mom? He's the one who came to pick me up to drive me to Coulson County." "Yeah, I like the look of him. I remember now, he was a nice young man. And then there's another nice man there, but he's an Englisher." "Well, you couldn't seriously consider him," Elsa said. Moira smiled at Elsa and shook her head. "Not really." Moira was pleased to get back home. In Coulson County, everything was just as she'd left it. "I appreciate you letting me stay here, Millie," Moira said. "But I should begin to look for a place where I can stay on a more permanent basis." "This can be permanent for you, Moira. I like having you here, and if you like it, why not stay on permanently?" Moira rubbed her forehead. "I don't know. It's close to school here, and the cats and I enjoy your company. I do hope you'll stay on. You don't mind having me here permanently? I mean, I guess I don't know how long I'd stay here before I go back home." "Stay as long as you wish. I'd love it if you stayed with us." Moira smiled. "I will, as long as you're sure that it's okay." "That would make me very happy." "Okay, I'll stay." Moira was pleased to stay with Millie and the cats. When Moira went back to school, she saw how much her students had gotten taller over the few weeks' break. Everything in Moira's life fell back into the usual routine. Over the next months, Moira got many letters from home, but the letter she was dreading from Elsa never arrived. Moira did receive a letter telling her that Hazel was going to have another baby. There was also a letter telling her that Elsa had rescued another dog from certain death, but there was no letter saying that Elsa and Tom would soon be married. She wished that she would get that letter soon, because waiting for it was taking its toll. Every time she opened a letter from home, her palms would sweat, her fingers would tremble, and her heart would race. It was Jeremiah who surprised everyone by saying that he would be getting married. He was marrying a girl from a different community. They'd been seeing each other for a year, and neither of them had shared their secret relationship. Although Moira was happy for him, she knew that it was another man who was out of her reach. Time was ticking by and she was helpless to stop it. Just as time was passing her by, so were opportunities. Even though she had never wanted Jeremiah as a husband, it was another door that was now closed. It was on a Saturday morning that she saw the doctor's buggy heading toward the house. She'd been sitting on the porch enjoying some midday winter sunshine. "Good morning, Miss Shantz," he said in a cheeky manner as he climbed down from his buggy. "Good morning to you, Doctor. To what do I owe the pleasure of your company?" He stopped in front of her. "Come for a ride in the sunshine. It's a perfect day. I don't have to work and I'd like to enjoy a few hours with you." Moira picked up the cat from her lap, rose to her feet and placed the cat back down on the chair where he went back to sleep. "Will I be back in the early afternoon? I told Millie I'd cook tonight." "I'll have you back in time to cook dinner. I'll get my coat and tell Millie where I'm going." Moira had been awake early and had done her washing and hung it out to dry, and that was the only thing she had to do for the whole day. Tomorrow, she'd sort out her lessons for her students for the coming week. Moira liked the rare moments she spent with Nathan. He was the type of man she'd be happy to have as a husband, except for the fact they were from 2 different worlds. While Nathan talked about his patience and his life, Moira wondered if he'd ever consider joining the Amish. Nathan had never asked Moira for anything further than the occasional dinner. They spent a few hours together every so often, where he would talk and she would listen. Chapter 11. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. Galatians chapter 6 verse 9. Another year went by, and Moira had to decide whether she would have Christmas with Millie or go back home. Pressure from her family to come home finally swayed Moira's decision. She would have this Christmas with her family, and next Christmas she would enjoy with Millie and Millie's relations. The long trip home was tiresome as usual, but Moira was looking forward to seeing everyone again. She hadn't spoken to her parents in quite some time, and she missed her brothers and sisters. The 2-day journey went by fairly quickly, the weather slowly changing as she traveled the dirt roads toward her hometown. When she arrived at her parents' house, she smiled, a feeling of joy and relief engulfing her. She paid her driver and grabbed her belongings, struggling under their weight as she hobbled up to the front door and pushed it open. "I'm home," she called out. Her mother appeared in front of her with a smile from ear to ear. "Moira, you're home. Welcome back, my daughter." "Welcome back," she said, throwing her arms around Moira and squeezing tightly. "How are you?" Moira replied, happy to see how much her mother missed her. "Good. Good. Your father will be so happy," her mother said, stepping back slightly. Moira walked in and put her bags in the corner of the front room. "The house looks amazing," she said, looking into the living room. "You've changed things around a bit." "Oh, that was only for Elsa's big announcement. We had everyone here to announce her betrothal straight after they told the bishop. We had a great many people here, and haven't put things back in their proper place yet." "What?" Moira's heart sank as her throat tightened. It felt like a hand was squeezing at her neck. "What are you talking about?" "Betrothal." "Oh," her mother gasped. "Elsa hasn't told you yet?" "She's going to be upset with me," she said, shaking her head. "She said she would write to you." The news hit Moira like a sack of potatoes falling from the rafters, so unexpected and crushing. "I just haven't had the chance to talk to her much lately. She told me they were dating, but," she stammered, looking off into the distance as thoughts of lost opportunities swirled around in her mind. "Speaking of Elsa, here she is now," Moira's mother said, nodding down the long hallway. Moira looked over to see her friend running up to her with open arms and a wide smile. "Moira, it's been so long. You look well as always. How has everything been at the school?" Moira smiled at Elsa and returned the warm embrace. It sure was nice to see Elsa again, but at the same time, a feeling of loneliness and heartbreak washed through Moira as thoughts of her friend marrying Tom flashed over and over in her mind. "Thank you," she replied. "School has been going extremely well, actually. The students can be a bit of a handful some days, but they are very respectful and helpful in general." "That's great news," Elsa said. "Let's go somewhere and talk." "That would be a good idea," called Moira's mother. "Especially considering I accidentally told her something she hadn't heard yet." Elsa spun around to look directly at Moira. "I wanted to be the one to tell you first. I wrote a letter, but there wouldn't have been time enough for you to get it. I only sent it 2 days ago." Moira nodded. "It'll most likely be waiting for me when I get back. I did suspect that it would happen. It was certain to happen sooner or later." Elsa turned away, shaking her head and sighing. "I wanted to be the one to tell you." She turned back toward Moira with a look of disappointment in her eyes. "I should have written about it, but I thought it would be better to say it in person." "Well then, tell me all about it." Moira did her best to hide her sadness for the sake of her friend. "It has just been really great lately," Elsa said, sitting on the sofa. Moira walked over and sat beside Elsa, to listen to the story of how her best friend and the boy Moira had liked most of her life had gotten engaged. She couldn't shrug off the strange feeling of nausea in her stomach, but she did her best to hide the negativity from her face. Despite the difficulty of accepting the news, Elsa was very important to Moira, and Elsa's happiness meant more to Moira than her own. "So how did it happen?" Moira asked. "Well, it's just been a whirlwind, really. We grow closer with every passing day. He has seemed much less distracted than normal, and his heart grew fonder of me with each passing day, or so he claims," Elsa said, laughter erupting from her lips. "Anyway, our affection for each other has just swelled up over time since then, and he recently asked me to be his wife. I never expected such a thing, but maybe it's meant to be." Elsa's face lit up like the sun on a warm day. "I'm so happy for you both," Moira replied, trying to push visions of them embracing out of her mind. Her heart felt like it was going to explode at any moment. When will it be? We haven't set a date just yet, but we're planning on doing so very soon. Will you be staying with us for a while? He wants to get married very soon. I need to get back soon. Moira had just decided 2 seconds ago that she could not stay there and watch her best friend and the man that she had once loved get married. You'll wait to see me get married? You'll have to be my attendant. Moira bit her lip and cast her gaze downward. I don't think I can do that, Elsa. It's hard for me, and you know why. Oh, of course I'm being selfish. I do hope you'll be there, though. You're my best friend in the world. Moira looked back up into Elsa's face and smiled. And you're mine. Oh, well, at least you have a few days to spend with your friends and family, Elsa said. Moira stood up. I should get settled in and unpack. She grabbed her bags and headed toward the bedroom that she still called hers. Word had gotten around that Moira had arrived home, and a crowd had gathered at the Shantz house for dinner. All her brothers and sisters were there, including their growing brood of children. Moira was happy to see them but wished that circumstances were different. She no longer felt safe and protected amongst her family, not when Elsa was going to marry Tom. She felt safe and protected at Millie's house with the cats, nothing could hurt her there. The next morning before daybreak, she scribbled a note, then headed for one of the main roads out of town. She hoped that someone on the main road wouldn't mind taking her to the stagecoach that went past Coulson County. Her small town was friendly like that. The sun broke into the sky just as she reached the main road. With her satchel under her arm, she headed to the town. She'd been walking for half an hour when she heard the first clip-clop of hooves. She turned to see an old man in a wagon with a load of hay. He stopped beside her and asked where she was headed. Before long, she was on her way back home. Sitting in the stagecoach, she felt sad for her mother and father. She knew that they'd be most upset to see her gone the next morning. Maybe she should have stayed to keep them happy, but she couldn't go through life making everyone else happy rather than herself. That's why she was in this position. She should have just told Tom that she loved him, then it would be her getting married to him and not Elsa. Now she would spend Christmas with Millie. Next Christmas she would go home and face them all. Thinking about a year from now sent Moira thinking of Elsa and Tom having a family together. She looked out across the dusty wasteland with bitterness in her heart. On the drive to Earl Town just a day before, she had admired the landscape. Now that same landscape was nothing but a barren desert wasteland just like her heart. Millie was both surprised and delighted to see Moira. It was night, and they ate soup and fresh bread while Moira told Millie all that had happened and why she hadn't stayed. Millie remained silent and offered no comment or advice, as she normally did. It was the next morning that Moira received the letter that Elsa had sent, telling of her upcoming marriage. Moira looked at the envelope before she opened it. It was Elsa's handwriting, and Moira knew what was in it. She tossed it aside, she would read it later. That the letter you were waiting for? Millie asked. Moira nodded. Open it then. Moira pushed out her lips. Should I? I know what's in it. I really don't want to see it in writing. It would be hurting myself all over again to read it. She picked up the letter and handed it to Millie. Why don't you read it, and see if there's anything important in it that I should know? Millie took the letter and opened it. After a moment she laughed. It's nothing to laugh at, Millie. Millie thrust the letter at Moira. Read it for yourself. Moira frowned and took the letter. In the letter, Elsa talked about a man called Mark Thompson, and how they had recently met at a friend's wedding and their relationship had been like a whirlwind. Moira looked up at Millie. She hasn't mentioned Tom at all. Moira jumped up and down. When I was speaking to her, I assumed she was speaking about her and Tom. In fact, I think she might have even called him Tom, but his last name is Thompson, so that could have been a name that she called him for short. Or maybe she didn't mention the name Tom at all. Millie folded her arms across her chest. Are you going back there then? I'll stay and have Christmas with you, but I'll go back and see my friend get married after Christmas. Oh, Millie, why don't you come with me? My parents would love to meet you. I've told them about you. No. There would be no one to look after my cats. Jeremiah or Selma could do it. Jeremiah doesn't like them, and neither does Selma, and the cats can sense that. Selma likes them. It would be nice if you could come. Millie smiled. I can't. I'll go with you, Selma said. Millie and Moira jumped, as they hadn't seen Selma come into the house. You'd come with me? Moira asked. I've been waiting for God to bring a man to this community, and he hasn't, so I thought I should look further afield. Good, the community at Earltown is bigger. You could find someone there, and there's always people passing through at Christmas time, Moira said. A wide smile covered Selma's face. Wonderful. I'll go home now and pack. Selma turned on her heel and walked back out the front door. I'm not going for some days, Selma. I know, Selma called back. That night, Moira wrote back to Elsa and wrote to her parents. She apologized to both for disappearing and told Elsa that she would be there on Elsa's wedding day to see her get married. Over Christmas dinner with Millie's family, Moira told everyone that she and Selma were going back to Earltown soon. Jeremiah offered to drive them there, saying that he wouldn't mind visiting the place again. Chapter 12. And now abide at faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 13. After Moira, Selma, and Jeremiah stayed overnight at the bishop's house, which was their midway stop to Earltown, they made an early start the next morning. The bishop would continue on the same journey to marry Mark and Elsa in a few days' time. Selma had already agreed to stay with Moira's parents. Moira knew that Jeremiah had previously stayed with the Herschels. You'll have to stay with my family, Jeremiah. We've plenty of spare rooms, Moira said. Thank you. I know the Herschel family and they have offered for me to stay any time I'm passing through. I'm sure they won't mind having me there for a few days. Okay. Moira nodded, glad that he had somewhere nice to stay. Weddings were huge events in the community, and people would travel for miles to attend them. Your friend Elsa is pleased, I guess. Pleased that you're going to be there for her wedding, Selma said. Yeah, she is. We've been like sisters. She moved into my house, well, my parents' house, shortly after Hazel got married. Selma raised her eyebrows. And Hazel is the closest sister to you in age? Yeah, and the oldest one is Miriam, who's married to the Stutzman's eldest boy, Adam. Yeah, I know the Stutzmans, Jeremiah said. I'm so glad that you're driving us, Jeremiah. It's much easier than going by stagecoach. I welcome the chance to go to new places. The gentle rocking of the wagon caused Moira to get sleepy. Her eyes began to close. Jeremiah glanced at her. Why don't you lie down in the back seat? I'm sure you won't miss anything. Moira shook her head. This was the second day of the journey, and they were getting closer to home. No, I'll stay awake. Once Jeremiah reached Moira's parents' house, he greeted them and then continued on his way to the Herschels' house. After Moira talked to her mother and father and enjoyed a cup of coffee, Elsa stole her away and soon they were in Elsa's bedroom. Selma stayed and talked to Mr. and Mrs. Shantz. Elsa sat cross-legged on her bed and smoothed her dress over her knees. Moira kneeled on the bed in front of her. So, you thought I was talking about Tom Miller when I told you I was getting married? Yeah, I did. Well, you did say that you were kind of sweet on each other. The next progression of your relationship would be to get married. I heard nothing else, and then you told me you were getting married. Why wouldn't I think that you were getting married to Tom? Elsa threw back her head and laughed. If only my letter had gotten there sooner, or if you'd stayed here a little longer instead of running away. Moira rubbed her forehead. You know how I've always felt about Tom. No, I won't hear of it again. You can't lay claim to a man that you leave alone and don't even write to. He told you that? Yeah, we talked about a great many things. He told me how you insisted that he not write to you. Now you come back here all moony-eyed or with stars in your eyes, whatever that expression is, pleased that I'm not marrying him. Do you expect him to wait for you to change your mind? No. Moira shook her head vigorously. She was a grown woman, and not used to someone speaking to her like Elsa was. It's not like that, Elsa. Elsa folded her arms and pushed her legs straight on the bed in front of her. Well, what is it like, Moira Shantz? Moira sighed. I like Tom, I possibly love him, I guess. Aren't you going to do something about it? Do you think it's too late? Is he upset that I went away? Ask him for yourself. Grown-up people talk to each other, you know. If you'd talked to me, you wouldn't have run back to Coulson County like you did, and you could have been my attendant. Now, Hazel is to be my attendant. I'm sorry, Elsa. I was just so upset, and I couldn't stay around if you were going to marry Tom. Someone will someday. You have to tell him how you feel. Didn't he ask you to marry him before you left? Moira gasped. He told you that? Elsa nodded. Just talk to him. You need to sort things out like two adults. It's just that he's so quiet. No, he's not quiet. I'd say that he scares you and you are being shy. That's why you like to think he's quiet. Moira scrunched up her nose. She didn't think that was correct. I'll talk to him when I see him next, okay? Elsa gave a sharp nod of her head. Good. Some sense from the schoolteacher at last. Moira giggled. Now let's talk about what's been happening with you. Elsa told her all about the wedding preparations, the food for the wedding, and the clothes she had sewn for herself, Mark, and their attendants. Moira made an effort to push her personal concerns aside and listen to the happy voice of her good friend. I'm only upset that Mom and Dad won't be there to see me marry. Moira nodded as she searched for words of comfort. Your parents will be there and they've been wonderful to me. They've been like my parents these last couple of years. Yeah, and we'll all be there for you, Moira said. Elsa sighed. I'm only going to stay at the school for a little while after I'm married, just until they find a replacement. Why don't you take the job? Me? Yeah, it will be perfect. You can move back here and marry Tom just like you've always wanted. Moira pulled her mouth to one side. If she moved back there, Tom would see that she was there to stay, and surely he would propose to her again. She'd miss Millie though, and the cats. If only she could pick up Millie's house with Millie and the cats inside, and place it in Earltown. Elsa interrupted her thoughts. It's something to think about, isn't it? They might find a replacement for me fast, but I haven't told them yet. Let me know what you decide. Yeah, I will. On hearing hoofbeats, Elsa jumped off the bed and raced to the window. It's Mark, you must come down and meet him. And it looks like Hazel and Stephen are in the buggy right behind him. They must have heard that you've arrived. The two girls hurried down the stairs. Moira was pleased to see her sister, and anxious to meet the mysterious new Amish man who had captured the heart of her best friend. Chapter 13. Thou wilt show me the path of life, in thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Psalm chapter 16 verse 11. Elsa's wedding was held at Moira's parents' home. Moira saw Jeremiah arrive with the Herschel family and went out of the house to meet them. Every moment she was looking around, waiting for Tom to arrive. Just as she was about to walk inside with Jeremiah and the Herschels, she noticed Tom's buggy drawing close to the house. She hesitated at the door, but instead of going to speak to him, she decided it best to show Jeremiah where he could sit. She talked to Tom later. Moira was seated close to the front when Tom walked in the door. He gave Moira a smile, looking directly at her. She smiled back, pleased that he had seen that she was there. Tom sat in one of the rows at the back of the room. When the wedding was over, it was one of Moira's jobs to help the ladies spread out the food while the men moved the benches out of the house. Moira was glad to be in the warmth of the kitchen, as the day was growing colder. Once her duties were over for the time being, she went in search of Tom. Before she found Tom, she noticed that Mr. Stutzman and Selma were engrossed in a conversation. Selma had come to Earltown hopeful of finding a husband. Moira made a mental note to be sure to tell Selma that Mr. Stutzman's wife had recently died, and he wouldn't be interested in another marriage. Then she saw Tom walking by himself, heading to one of the tables. Hello, Tom. Moira, it's good to see you. I was told you wouldn't be here. She shrugged, embarrassed at what he might have heard. I'm here. I can see that. She waited for him to say something, and when he didn't, she glanced at the ground, searching her head for words to speak. I hear you're doing well as a teacher. Yeah, I'm enjoying it, she said, looking up into his face. Seems you made the right decision by leaving then. Moira's mouth fell open, whether it was in shock or to say something to set him straight, she wasn't certain, but before she could speak he said, I see someone over there I must speak to if you'll excuse me. Just like that, he walked away from her. She watched him leave her. He didn't go to anyone at all, he went straight to the food table and piled his plate with food. He wasn't interested in her at all, and she couldn't blame him. He had asked her to marry him, and maybe she should have done so when she had the chance. He turned back to look at her and smiled when their eyes locked. He set his plate on the table and walked back to her. At that moment, someone tapped her on the shoulder. She spun around to face Jeremiah. "Oh, Jeremiah." She turned back to look at Tom, who had stopped in his tracks. She turned back to speak to Jeremiah and then spun around to speak to Tom, but Tom had walked away. "Who's that?" Jeremiah asked. "A friend, my friend Tom." Jeremiah raised his eyebrows. "I hope that he didn't think that we are more than friends or anything." Was she that easy to read? "No, he's just a friend." "It's not like that." "It's not like that at all," Moira insisted a little too fervently. "Okay," Jeremiah said. Moira took Jeremiah to introduce him to a few people, thinking that she would talk to Tom later. People were beginning to leave when Moira saw Tom walking over to her. "Moira, I've come to say goodbye. How long are you staying here?" "I'm heading back soon. Jeremiah was good enough to drive me here, and I can't keep him away from home too long." "Was that who you were speaking with earlier?" "Yeah, that was Jeremiah. I was hoping that you would have decided to come home. Everyone misses you, Moira." She looked into his eyes, hoping and waiting for him to say something to show her that he still felt the same as the day he'd asked her to marry him. "Well, goodbye for now, Moira." He smiled at her and walked away before she had a chance to say goodbye. Now that Moira was back in Coulson County, she thought about her special friendship with the doctor. If she weren't Amish, she was sure that their relationship would have developed in a different direction. It was during one of their special dinners together that Nathan broke the news of something very important. "I need to tell you something, Moira." "What is it? You look so serious." "I'm moving to New York." Nathan had told Moira many things about New York. He'd described it as being two worlds. There was poverty, sickness, homelessness, but he'd said it was one of the most spectacular and inspiring places he'd ever been. "When?" "In a week's time. I've been offered a good position at one of the hospitals there." "I see." Moira looked down at the table service in front of her. Then she looked into his face. "I'm pleased about it if you are." "I'm kind of pleased, but I'll miss you, of course." Moira smiled and felt color rise in her cheeks. "Why don't you come with me?" Moira gave a little giggle. "I can't. I've got the school and everything." By everything, she meant that she was Amish and he wasn't. She knew in what capacity he meant for her to go to New York, and she couldn't or wouldn't compromise her standards or morals. He wasn't the marrying kind, nor was he the kind who would consider joining the community that he had referred to as a backward life. "I wish you would, though." "I'll miss you." "You have no idea how I'll miss you. You're a unique woman, Moira." "So I've been told," Moira said. "Who will I talk to about all my problems?" He reached across the table and placed his hand on hers. "Write to me. One day when I'm old, I might get married." Moira could not suppress her laughter. "I don't think I'll ever see the day that you get married." "I might," he said before he took a mouthful of whiskey. One thing that Moira had learned in life was that nothing ever stayed the same. Even in Earltown things had changed. Mrs. Stutzman had died, and the two families would never be the same as they struggled to move on with lives without their mother, wife, and dear friend. Moira stared into the candle flame in the center of the table and wondered at the meaning of life. Why were we here if our end was death? What was the point of it all? Why was life filled mostly with cruelty and disappointments? Tears filled her eyes as a sense of helplessness filled her body. "Hey." He squeezed her hand. "I'll visit, don't be so sad." She sniffed. "You will?" "I promise I will. I have to anyway. My mother lives here, and I'd be in trouble if I didn't come back and visit her now, wouldn't I?" Moira nodded, as she imagined the short and authoritative Mrs. Pettigrew. Moira was taken back to Millie's house in Dr. Pettigrew's smart black buggy drawn by his tall, shiny black horse. Everything about Nathan was precise, perfect, and pretty. When she got home, Moira saw that Millie was still awake doing her needlework by the gaslight. "Millie," Moira said with a start to see Millie awake so late. He's leaving, Moira said before Millie could say anything. Nathan's leaving. Millie dropped her needlework to her lap. Where's he going? He's moving to New York to work in some hospital. I'm sorry. He asked me to go with him. Millie frowned. What did you say? Moira slumped into the couch. It wasn't an offer of marriage. I'm not sure what the offer was of, I just know it wasn't an offer of marriage. And even if it were, it would never work between us. He'd never believe what we believe. He doesn't believe in God, he says that he believes in science. He was just a good friend. They're hard to come by sometimes, Millie said. For people like us, it's rare to find someone who stimulates our mind and our hearts at the same time. We do the same for them. Later that night in bed, Moira closed her eyes and thought about how her life had changed in the past 2 years. Then she wondered where she'd be 2 years from now. Chapter 14. This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Psalm chapter 118 verse 24. Another Christmas had rolled around, and this year, Moira and Selma had just retuned from some days in Earltown with Moira's family. Moira had wanted to stay with Millie for Christmas, but Millie had urged Moira to go see her family and Selma had tagged along. Selma had arranged for them to travel back to Colson County with some people she'd recently met, that lived a little further down the track from Colson County. Their wagon stopped at Millie's house to let Moira out and then set off to take Selma to her home. On the ride home, Moira couldn't get Tom out of her mind. It saddened her that he hardly spoke to her the whole time she was in Earltown. Moira watched the wagon leave, then looked over at the house to see that it was closed up. There was no smiling Millie at the front door and no cats asleep on the porch. Maybe it's too cold for her to have windows and doors open, Moira thought. Worried that Millie might be sick or unwell inside the house, Moira hurried to open the door only to find that it was locked. Moira hadn't thought to take a key with her, as Millie had never locked her house. After tapping on every window, there was no sign of Millie. She tried to stop the wagon of the people who had just dropped her off, hoping to have them drive her to Jeremiah's house, but they didn't hear her calls. She went around the house once more, peering through all the windows, but there was no Millie anywhere in the house and no cats. The sight disturbed her, something was wrong. There was only one thing to do. Moira would have to walk to Jeremiah's house. He'd know what was going on. Moira left her satchel on the porch and quickly made her way to Jeremiah's house. When she drew close to his house, she saw that there were 3 buggies outside. Jeremiah came out to greet her. From the look on his face, her worst fears were confirmed. Tears fell down Moira's cheeks as she asked, Millie? I'm sorry, Moira. Millie died yesterday. Moira collapsed on the ground. Dust flew around her skirts as she fell in a heap. She sniffed and tried to stop the tears, but she couldn't. She was my friend. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I know, Jeremiah said in a soothing tone as he held her in his arms. I can't believe it. I wasn't even here. She died in her sleep, she didn't suffer or anything, Moira. Moira struggled to stand, and Jeremiah helped her to her feet. You've got visitors? Moira asked, nodding toward his house. We're organizing times for the funeral and things. Moira nodded. This can't be happening. I should have stayed. I wanted to stay here for Christmas. I'll take you home. Jeremiah looked around. Did you walk here? Yeah, I just got back and the house was all locked up. Where are the cats? We're trying to find homes for them. I sent a letter to you yesterday telling you about Millie. I wasn't sure when you'd be back. I'll look after them, the cats. I'll have to find somewhere to stay too. Moira, Millie left the house to Selma. I'm sure Selma will let you stay on. Moira frowned at Jeremiah. Selma, she's just come home and she doesn't even know. I'll go and tell her now. I'll take you home first. Moira bit her lip. This was something that she hadn't expected. It was another shock. I can't, she stammered. Wait here, I'll go inside and let them know where I'm going. Dad can go through the details of the funeral with them, they don't need me. Moira waited outside for Jeremiah. Come on, he said when he came back from the house. I've already got my buggy ready to go. I came back from the store and hadn't unhitched it yet. That's good, Moira said, not really listening to what he was saying. This way. He guided her to the buggy. Where is Millie now? Moira asked, stepped up into his buggy. She's in our house. Where are the cats? She and Selma had to take care of the cats. That's what Millie would have wanted. They had been a family together, Millie, her, and the cats. He looked at his large red barn quite a distance from the house. We've got them locked in the barn. Can I take them home with me now? Yeah, if you'd like. There's only one that we had a problem with, he won't let anyone near him. I know the one, Moira said. He attacked me once when I tried to pat him. I've still got the scar. I never tried to pat him again. Well, let's get them, Jeremiah said, turning his buggy toward the barn. He opened the door of the barn slightly and slid through. Come on, Moira. Moira followed him. She called out to the cats and they all came to her except for one, who meowed from his comfortable place curled up on a bale of straw. They like you, Jeremiah said. Yeah, we're all old friends. Moira looked down at the cats and Fang was there too. That one there is the one we need to watch out for. Moira pointed to one nearby. We can close the others in the back of the buggy, and I'll put Fang in a basket. Okay. Jeremiah got Fang into the basket without too much trouble and loaded him into the buggy. They drove the short distance to Millie's house and then unloaded the cats into the house. Thank you for all your help, Jeremiah. Anything else I can do for you, Moira? She shook her head. It was late, she just wanted to sleep. I'll go to Selma's house now and tell her what's happened. I'll come back and see you first thing tomorrow. There's no school tomorrow, is there? Jeremiah asked. No, not for 3 more days. The funeral will be the day after tomorrow. Jeremiah put his hands on his hips and looked around the house. Moira sighed deeply. I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you, Jeremiah. Moira stood at the door and watched him drive the buggy away from the house. She wondered if she should have gone with Jeremiah to tell Selma about Millie, but she couldn't face it, it was all too upsetting. Moira closed the door and stepped back inside. She was glad that she had the cats there to keep her company. She bent down to pat Fang, hoping that he would have changed, but he hissed at her when her hand got close. Chapter 15. The name of the Lord is a strong tower, the righteous runneth into it and is safe. Proverbs chapter 18 verse 10. Days after the funeral, Moira received a letter from Tom. He'd heard of Millie's passing, and said how sorry he was that he hadn't heard in enough time to make it to the funeral. Moira hugged the letter to her heart, knowing that he still cared for her. Selma had moved into Millie's house, pleased to give up the small place that she'd leased for so many years. Both Selma and Moira took on the job of looking after the cats the best they could. Fang and Selma did not get along because Selma didn't understand that he didn't like to be touched. Instead of leaving him alone, she made it her mission to make him friendly. Nothing Selma had tried had worked. It was midday on the Saturday afternoon when Moira sat down to enjoy the summer sun. Millie had once told her that the only thing she could rely on in life was change, and Moira had come to know that her statement was true. Her life kept changing. Millie was gone, and now she lived in Millie's old house with Selma. Jeremiah had gotten married, Nathan had moved to New York, and everyone at Earltown her age was now married. Fang came out of the house and walked down the porch toward her. Hello, Fang, she said. Fang stopped still, and his green eyes studied her for a moment before he turned and walked in the other direction. He jumped on a chair at the other end of the porch. At least you haven't left me, Fang. Movement in the distance caught Moira's attention. She squinted to see who was driving the wagon heading to her house. When it got closer, she was certain that it was Tom. She stared in disbelief and rose to her feet, shaking her head. It certainly looked like Tom, but it couldn't possibly be him. What would Tom be doing so far from his home? It was Tom. She saw him clearly when he stopped the wagon and jumped down. She hurried toward him. Tom, what are you doing here? When they reached each other, he spoke. I've come here to ask you to marry me. Moira could not keep the smile from her face. It was a ridiculous thing, him coming all this way, a 2-day journey just to ask her something he could have asked her when he'd seen her at Christmas time or the Christmas before. You came all this way to ask me. Haven't you heard of writing a letter? She placed her hands on her hips and tipped her head to the side, trying to keep the happiness that welled up within her buried. I can't do this in a letter. He hurried to her, put his arm around her back, and pulled her close. She stared up into his face as he slowly lowered his lips onto hers. He kissed her with a gentleness that she'd never imagined was possible. Then he raised his head, but still his arm held her tightly. I've waited for you for too long, Moira. She thought about Elsa. Had he been thinking about Moira when he dated Elsa that time? She shut her eyes tightly. Moira, you should thank God that he is still single and hasn't married anyone, she told herself. She'd grown used to talking to herself these past months alone. She opened her eyes to see him staring at her intently. Their closeness caused her concern, so she took a step back. Moira wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. He smiled at her. What do you say? Moira, I've loved you for the longest time and don't see any reason to go home without you. I shall stay here until you say that you will marry me. Moira gave a laugh. This was what she'd always wanted. Tom had always remained the same. I suppose you're wondering about the time I was spending time with Elsa? We've never really spoken of it, so I'll tell you. The way I see things is that Elsa and I became friends because we both missed you. I reminded Elsa of you, and Elsa reminded me of you. I guess it was a way that I could feel that you were near me. He shrugged his shoulders. Then I woke up to myself. Elsa and I, or anyone else and I, wouldn't work. If you don't marry me, then I shall remain alone. He took a step forward. Alone, sad and alone. He grinned at her as if he knew what her answer would be. Moira was glad that Selma wasn't home to see her reunion with Tom. Moira took a deep breath. I will marry you, Tom. Tom raised his eyebrows and his face glowed. You will? She giggled and nodded. He drew her back close to him. You've made me a happy man. Moira was at home in his arms. It felt more right than anything else in her life had ever been. She looked into his eyes that were now creased with lines around the corners, and she remembered a more youthful Tom. She wondered if she'd wasted their younger years when they could have been married. Come back with me tomorrow. We'll get married straight away. We won't wait like a young couple. I'll tell the bishop we are good and ready now. We can call on him on our way back to Earltown. When we arrive in Earltown, it will be as man and wife. Moira giggled, wondering what her parents would think of her being married for the first time at her age. I'll have to take Fang with me, she said, pointing to the gray mottled cat on the couch. You can bring anything or anyone you wish. He leaned down to kiss her on the cheek, but she cheekily turned her face toward him and his lips touched hers. She'd waited a lifetime to feel a man's lips on hers, and she allowed herself to enjoy it once more. His lips were soft, warm, and tasted sweet. I can't wait until you're my wife, he said with a gentle hand on the back of her neck. Minutes later, she stood breathless as she watched him drive his wagon away. She'd neglected to ask where he was staying that night. She stepped inside and closed the door. Fang meowed from the porch, and she opened the door to let him inside. I'm getting married and we're moving to a new house, Fang. She bit her lip. She didn't even know what house she was going to. Looking around the house, she saw how many things needed to be packed if she were going to move out. The next day, she would have to tell Tom that it would take 3 more days to organize her leave. When Selma came home, Moira gave her the good news. When do you go? Selma asked. Soon, in a few days, I guess. I'll miss you, Moira. Come and visit me, come and stay whenever you wish. Selma smiled. I certainly will. I like your Earltown. Being dinner time, the cats were meowing around the kitchen. Remember your promise to Millie? Selma asked, pointing to Fang. Moira pulled a face and looked at Fang. You want me to take Fang? Well, he's really not nice to me or the other cats. I've been unable to tame him despite my hard efforts. You did tell her you'd always look after her cats. Sure, I'd love to take him. Tom arrived the next day to collect Moira and Fang. I know I was unrealistic expecting you to drop your whole life in half a day, Tom said. I'll have to let the school board know too. I think they can do without me now that I've got another teacher there. There's also a part-time teacher who wants to be full-time rather than 2 days a week. Good, everything is turning out well. Now where do you want me to start? You could drive me into town and I'll sort things out with Mrs. Pettigrew. She's the main person I should speak with. She'll arrange everything with the board. Then we can come back here and start packing. They spent the rest of the day running errands, so Moira could end her life in Coulson County. Now she had another adventure to live. Her life was starting a new chapter and ending an old one. 3 days later, Fang was captured and placed in a large wicker basket and put in the back of the wagon with most of Moira's smaller belongings. Selma had packed up Millie's much-loved tea set for Moira to take with her, telling Moira, "Millie wanted you to have this." Moira stared at the tea set, which brought back many memories of lazy Saturday afternoons sitting and chatting with Millie about life and love. "Will you visit me soon, please, Selma?" Selma nodded. "I will, and I'll have Jeremiah come and feed the cats, even though he hates them." Moira and Tom waved to Selma as they set off in the loaded-down wagon. Their next stop would be the bishop's house. Tom had already sent word to him that they wanted to be married before they left his house. Although Moira was excited to get married, she was a little disappointed that none of their family members would be there. But then again, she'd always done things differently from the rest of her family anyway. The Amish population had grown quickly, and another bishop had been appointed to help cover the huge distance that Bishop John Fair used to cover by himself. Moira hadn't seen Bishop Fair in a very long time. She was surprised to see how old, gray, and frail he'd grown in just a couple of years. Tabitha, his wife, was just the same as she'd always been. "I'd never thought I'd see the day that you'd get married," the bishop said to Moira. "It's been a long time coming," the bishop's wife added. "I wasn't so sure myself." "Oh, I have my cat in the wagon, where can I put him?" "You can put him in any of the spare rooms." "You're staying with us tonight, aren't you?" the bishop's wife asked. Tom and Moira both nodded. "Well, dinner will be in about another hour," Tabitha said. "Would you like to get married tonight?" the bishop asked. "Or would you like to get married tomorrow morning before you leave?" On hearing Fang's yowls, Tom said, "I'll just need to get Fang." Tom brought the wicker basket in from the wagon, and Tabitha showed him the room where to put Fang. When Tom came out, he joined the bishop and Moira once more. "To answer your question, I'd like to get married tonight," Tom said. "Tom, maybe we should get married in the morning," Moira said. "Anything you want, Moira, is fine with me." "Tomorrow it is then," the bishop said. Moira didn't want to spend the first night of marriage in someone else's house. She wanted their first night of marriage to be spent in Tom's house, their own house. She wouldn't feel comfortable if they were to spend the night together in the bishop's house. If they got married that night, would they be expected to sleep in separate rooms or the same room? It was all too difficult to think about. She was glad that Tom had let her make that decision. Moira headed into the kitchen to help Tabitha with the meal. Tom talked to the bishop in the other room. "Are you sad that you've left it so long to have children?" Tabitha asked. Moira frowned, annoyed by the question. She was still young. She smiled and hid her irritation. "I have many nieces and nephews, too many to count. My life's been full of children. My days have also been filled with the laughter of children. I'm not upset about anything of the kind. Besides, I'm still only young." "That's good. I don't know what I would have done if I couldn't have had children like some women. That's all I wanted before I got married." "You must have many grandchildren, Tabitha." "I've got 25 now." "That's a lot." "There'll be more coming, I'm certain of it. Mary and Jacob have just started, they only have one so far." Moira vaguely remembered that Mary was the bishop and Tabitha's youngest. "Do your parents know that you're on your way back?" "This was all a bit of a surprise," Tom tells us. "I don't know what they know or they don't know. I haven't written them of it. I'd get there before a letter would anyway." Tom didn't tell them why he was going to Coulson County. "They said to be sure to say hello to me." Moira gave a little giggle, thinking of the reaction of her friends and family. "I was sure you were sweet on Tom years ago. Just as I was certain that your sister Hazel was sweet on Stephen. I did like Tom, it's true. I remember telling my sisters and my mother that I liked Tom." Tabitha gave another laugh. "Whenever we visited Earltown, or any other community, I would tell John who I thought would be the next couple to marry. I was right more times than I was wrong. That would be a rare talent to have." Moira was seeing a new side of Tabitha, a more human side. She figured it couldn't be easy being the bishop's wife and having a role to play, a role that she wouldn't have had before she married John. It might have been something for which she would not have asked. "Thank you for having us stay here tonight, Tabitha, and for letting Fang stay here. You are always welcome in this house. Your family has been a strong member of our community, and I'd do anything for God's people." "Anything at all," Tabitha said. Chapter 16. Being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Philippians chapter 1 verse 6. The next morning Tom and Moira were married in a quiet ceremony, which is exactly what they both wanted. When Moira and Tom arrived to tell Moira's parents, they were not surprised, but they were very happy to hear the news. Then the newlyweds traveled to tell Tom's parents, who were equally as delighted. They stayed with Tom's parents until Tom built a house on the edge of his parents' land. They needed an extra teacher at the school for 2 days a week, and Moira was happy to accept the job. Moira was happy to be surrounded by her family and her nieces and nephews. 2 years on, Moira still had Fang, even though half his fur had fallen out and he was just as snappy and unfriendly. Fang had never tried to run away though. He expected that he would be cared for and fed. Selma had visited Earltown often, just as she'd said. Today she sat on Moira's porch with her, enjoying the warm summer sun. "I'll bet you were glad to find out you were having a baby after all this time," Selma said. "Yeah, surprised and delighted too," Moira said, touching her rounded belly. "After years of looking after everyone else's children." Selma reached out and grabbed Moira's hand. "Millie would have been so pleased, and so proud of you, of the woman you've become." Moira's eyes grew moist as tears pooled. "Do you think so?" She blinked rapidly to stop the tears, but had to wipe one away as it fell down her cheek. "You were like a daughter to her." Moira looked out across the fields. "I'm going to call the baby Millie if she's a girl." "Then I'm sure you're having a girl." "I hope so. I'd like a girl." Moira rubbed her belly again. Tom came out of the barn and walked toward them with a huge smile on his face. "You two talking baby talk again rather than making my midday meal?" Selma rose to her feet. "It's warming, and I'll just set it on the table for you." She turned to Moira. "You stay here in the sunshine." Selma hurried into the house, and Tom sat down on the empty chair next to Moira. "You know, I've made friends with Fang," he said. Moira searched his face to see whether he was joking or serious. "No, you haven't." He nodded. "I have. I call out his name and he meows back." Moira shook her head. "You're so silly sometimes." He reached out and grabbed her hand. "I'm so silly that I waited too long to make you my wife. I'm glad I did though. You've made me happier than I ever thought was possible." Moira looked across the fields and thought about her time in Coulson County, the new friends and the new experiences she'd had. She'd risked Tom not waiting for her and marrying someone else. She bit her lip, thinking that if Tom hadn't waited for her, she might be living alone with lots of cats, not just Fang. She looked back at Tom. "I thought my life was good, but you've made it even better." "You're glad then that you came back and married me once you tried life somewhere else?" Tom asked. "Of course I am. This is what was meant to be. Everyone's happy, even Fang, well, as happy as he can be. We have God, we have good friends, and soon we'll be parents." "It's ready and on the table," Selma called from within the house. "You coming in?" Tom asked Moira. "We've eaten." She patted her stomach. "When we're hungry, we can't wait." He leaned over and gave her a kiss on her forehead. 5 months later, things had changed again for Moira. "It's a girl, you have a daughter," the midwife said, handing Moira the wet, squirming bundle. The midwife placed the baby on Moira's tummy and covered her in a white cotton blanket. "Hello, baby Millie," Moira whispered. She turned to the midwife. "Can you let my husband in?" The midwife opened the door and Tom fell through and rushed to his wife's side. He looked at the baby, tears falling down his face. He kissed Moira on her forehead, and then he touched the baby gently on her cheek. "Our first child. Our first daughter, Tom. This is our little Millie." "A girl." Moira smiled. "Yeah, a girl." "Tom, what made you come to Coulson County that day? How did you know that I would marry you?" I never asked you that. He gave her another kiss on her forehead. It just had to be, that's all. I couldn't carry on without you in my life. Well, I could have, I suppose, but I sure didn't want to. She looked down at her baby and said a silent prayer of thanks for her life. She had been happy with her life in Coulson County and could have continued with that life, but when Tom had asked her to marry him for the second time, she could only say yes. He leaned closer and whispered, I took a step in faith and God helped you to see what a good man I am. Moira laughed. He had always made her happy. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew chapter 6 verse 13. Thank you for listening to Finding Love. The next book in the Amish Bride series is Amish Second Loves.